thick, dark hair sure accentuates his heavy-set brow, she observed. Together, they give his eyes a deep, shadowy, almost sinister look. A shiver ran through the attractive young redhead as her thoughts continued. The same eyes I can feel undressing me even when I'm not looking. He would probably be considered handsome if he weren't so. Foreboding. Yeah, that's the right word. That's just how he appears. From the moment Millie walked in, the male bartender had been constantly staring, watching her every move. Normally, she would be on her way home, putting as much distance between the impolite a-hole and herself as possible. But since Millie was here with a work colleague and expecting others, she felt safe. Although his ill-mannered behavior had unnerved her at first, now Millie just found it irritating as she finished her second drink. A slight buzz had begun to lift the depressive weight of her anxiety. For the first time since her arrival, Millie was beginning to relax. Except for the few times she glanced at the bartender, Millie was starting to enjoy herself and have fun. Diligently glancing around the lounge, she realized, "Damn you Ouroboros, you've been gone for a while." Millie wondered, where could you have gotten off to? Coworkers don't just disappear. After her eyes did one more sweep, she was satisfied Will wasn't in the lounge. Millie began watching and observing everyone coming or going from the hotel lobby. Her seat was in a perfect position to keep an eye on the only public entrance and exit. While swirling her drink and checking her watch for the umpteenth time, Millie suddenly felt cold liquid slosh over her fingers. Confused, giddy, and a bit dizzy, it slowly dawned on her while peering at her hand. I just spilt my drink. That's weird, she thought while wiping her fingers with her drink napkin. Nothing like that ever happened before, not after just 2 drinks. Her wrinkled brow reflected her desperate attempt to stay focused while tapping nervously on the table with her straw. She was unconsciously fighting to keep her eyes and head from nodding when suddenly from over her shoulder came a familiar but unexpected voice. "Hello, Millie, mind if I sit down?" Jumping in surprise, the redhead squealed before clasping one hand over her mouth in an exaggerated gesture as the false sensation of falling caused her to grab the table to steady herself. Her reply tumbled out in a slurred, jumbled mess. "Mr. Courtier, what ya doing here?" "No, I don't mind at all, please have a seat." Millie still maintained enough sensibility to know her cheeks were flushed by the embarrassment she felt at the moment. The wiry man slid in across from her, his ever-present cane now resting on the table. He was average height, smallish with a well-toned build, sandy brown hair, dark-rimmed glasses, and dark brooding eyes. Millie had heard stories about how he injured his leg. There were so many, speculations really, none of them very flattering. Over the last few months, she noticed that it seemed his limp was becoming less pronounced. As Millie watched her boss adjust himself in the seat, the petite blonde server came over to take his order. "If I want a beer, what are my choices?" he asked the cocktail waitress. After inquiring about the available beer options, he hardly looked at the waitress as she began reciting the current list. Instead, he sat staring at Millie through the entire ordeal. After carefully considering the possibilities, "I'll have a Samuel Adams winter lager on draft," he stated. While the waitress was filling his order, Becca began to feel uncomfortable as Mr. Courtier sat scrutinizing her. Finally, he said, "After hours, please call me Darren." She nodded as the blonde female server brought his beer. He looked up, smiled, and asked, "How much do I owe you?" The girl replied, "Oh, I can run you a tab." Mr. Courtier motioned with his hand to stop her and said, "Thank you for the offer, but I always pay as I go." After pulling out his wallet, he slipped the server a $100 bill. Smiling cheerfully, she counted out his change, and he handed her back a $10 tip. Her eyebrows shot up as she said, "Thanks, sexy. I'll make sure to take good care of you." He looked at her with a bit of mischief twinkling in his eyes and replied, "It is, and would be my pleasure." Millie followed Darren's eyes as they stared at the girl's backside as she headed towards the bar. He obviously enjoyed the view. When Millie looked back, her boss raised his glass to her, said, "Salute," then took a long swig. Suddenly, Mill felt confused. "All I've ever heard at work is, Mr. Courtier never joins in the parties or after-hour wind-downs. Then why is he here now?" She wondered. Focusing hard, Millie tried to recall what had transpired before his arrival. Millie remembered that when she first got there, Will had already claimed a booth conveniently located near the hallway leading to the restrooms. As he waved to her, she watched his eyes roam over her lime green dress a moment or two longer than necessary before eventually settling on her face. "Hey Millie, I'm headed to the bar. I have the others' orders. Since the first round is on me, what will you be having, my lady?" Will's voice was deep and husky, sexy even. She involuntarily shivered, watching his tongue dance across his lips, leaving a trace of moisture. More quickly than she wanted, Millie replied, Thanks. I'm in the mood for an amaretto sour. She flushed a little as she watched Will walk away. Millie was concerned that no one from the office had shown up yet, other than the two of them. It had been Will who told her about the happy hour tonight. Moments later, a cocktail waitress came over and asked, Can I get you something to drink, sweetie? No. Millie replied sharply, rousing herself from her hypnotic interlude. Realizing her concern was showing, she quickly extended her finger towards the bar and politely added, One of our group just went to the bar to get the drinks. Thanks anyway. As her eyes followed in the direction Millie pointed, the blonde scowled at the sight of Will talking to the dark-haired bartender, who even she had noticed leering at Millie. He gave both of them the creeps. Thanks, the waitress said before moving off to the next table. Millie noticed she kept looking back towards the two men at the bar. Will came back a few minutes later and placed 5 drinks around the table, laughing. Okay, now where are the others? They knew what time we were supposed to start. They wouldn't want their drinks to get hot. Millie giggled as he chuckled at his own pun. The two of them talked and laughed for a few minutes. Millie finished her drink feeling very relaxed. For the first time in ages, she began to enjoy herself. She hardly noticed when the lights slowly dimmed or the soft music began playing. Will asked, and she accepted. 3 or 4 couples were already dancing as he took Millie's hand and led her to the dance floor. After sliding his other around her back, he nodded to make sure she was ready. Millie was surprised. Will proved to be a very good dancer as he spirited her around with skillful ease. He kept her on the floor through several dances, each a little slower, and each with her pressed a little tighter to his body. She had her head on his shoulder by the time the last one finished. Suddenly, Millie pulled sharply away from him and moved quickly towards their table. Flushed from the sensations, she was deeply embarrassed over having allowed her work associate to get too close for comfort. She returned to her seat and picked up her empty glass. Seeing her looking around trying to get the server's attention, Will said, Millie, why don't you take the slow gin fizz next to you? I'll order another when the others get here. After thinking about it for a moment, Millie felt safe enough to brush aside her concerns. She could always take a taxi home. Picking up the drink, she quickly emptied half the glass. She noticed the smile that creased Will's lips. It always made him look the bad boy to her, a little devilish but not mean. Will had quite the reputation with girls in the office. The fact she was alone with him made Millie feel a bit uncomfortable, but ever so naughty. There had been gossip that Will was a player, an active player. Millie was not interested in ever becoming a player. She loved her husband too much. At the moment, they were going through a bit of a rough spot in their marriage. The last thing Mill needed was trouble, and sure as hell not the kind that came from ending up in someone else's bed. Millie wasn't sure if Will knew that Scott, her husband, was a police officer. She felt it should be mentioned, but it had been her experience that knowing about Scott's job made to many people uncomfortable. She decided it was best to keep it to herself and not take the chance of putting a damper on everyone's evening. While they talked, Millie explained, My husband always seems to be working the 3 to 11 shift with rotating weekends off. Right now things are a bit stressed between us with his job and all. Will nodded, appearing to listen intently, touching, almost stroking her hand and assuring her things would probably get better soon. Millie moved her hands to her lap. His unwanted attempts at physical contact unsettled her. A few minutes later, Will teased her as she finished her drink by saying, If I had you at home, I would quit any job that kept me away from you for more than 5 minutes. Millie giggled while blushing at the compliment. Will downed his beer and pointed to her empty glass and asked, One more, ma'am? Millie thought about what awaited her at home. Another evening of eating alone and falling asleep in bed before her husband got there. Quickly deciding that 3 drinks wouldn't be too much for her to handle, she answered, Sure, that'd be great, but I must insist I get this round. Millie fished the money out of her purse and handed it to Will. He smiled and said, Thank you. My mom always said if it's free, take 2. As he turned to go, he chuckled to himself, mumbling, It's going to be free all right, and before the night's over, I'll take everything you've got to offer, at least twice. Millie was confused, but before she could respond to what she thought she heard him mumble, he turned away, moving with purpose towards the bar. As he walked away, she watched the swagger of his rear end. Damn, he sure does have a cute little butt, she said out loud to herself, then giggled as she looked around to see if anyone heard her. Thinking to herself that was uncalled for, I am a married woman. Taking one more look at Will's backside, she giggled again and whispered, Okay, I may be married, but I'm not dead. After returning with their drinks, Will offered to dance, but Millie decided it wasn't a good idea and politely declined. Will tilted his head back to get the last swallow before setting his second empty glass of the day on the table. As Millie watched the foam trail back down and dissolve into a small pool of beer at the bottom of his glass, Will decided it was time. He excused himself to go to the restroom. After realizing she had been sitting at the booth alone for some time, Millie had begun to wonder about Will's disappearance when, quite unexpectedly, her office manager, Mr. Courtier, showed up. Feeling uneasy about Mr. Courtier's sudden appearance, Millie asked, "What made you decide to join the after-hours wind-down today?" She was embarrassed again because her tongue felt thick and numb, causing her difficulties in pronouncing words. They kept coming out slurred, and the room was beginning to spin a bit too. Darren was able to decipher her intent as he looked at her with a forced smile on his face. "Oh, sometimes I do things that no one expects." Raising and bending 2 fingers on each hand like quotation marks, he added, "Just to keep everyone guessing." His eyes bore into Millie's as he asked the question, "Are you feeling all right, Mrs. Albrighton? You look a little peaked." She felt intimidated by his gaze, as if he was looking right through her. Millie licked her lips and replied very slowly, trying not to slur her words, "Yes, sir, I'm fine. But where did Mr. Burrows disappear to?" Darren grinned as he answered with a sarcastic flip, "Ah, yes, Mr. Burrows. I believe he is trying to figure out how to come out of the closet, my dear." For some reason, that was really funny to Millie. She laughed and mocked back, but her words were so incoherent they didn't make sense, even to her. Suddenly, Millie didn't feel so good. The room spun crazily, and she realized Darren was standing next to her, holding onto her arm with a surprisingly firm grip. She slumped into Darren, who held her tight. The last thing she heard was Darren saying, "Come on, help me get her to our room." Millie wanted, and tried, to scream, "No," but nothing seemed to be working. Then everything went black. Millie felt the warmth of the sun on her face, but her head felt like it was full of cotton. "Good Lord, my mouth and throat are so dry." As she opened her eyes, the rest of her words stuck in her throat. In the lightheadedness of her semi-confusion, she blinked in silent prayer, praying the world would change as she opened her eyes once more to look around the obvious hotel room. The dark side of reality suddenly plunged its hidden dagger into her soul. Her guilty conscience twisted in agony with each turn of the blade. She slowly faced what must have occurred as she recalled the last words she heard before blacking out. "Come on, help me get her to our room." Suddenly howling out in pain, "Oh God, no. Please no. What have I done?" She realized, my boss Darren Courtier and my supervisor Will Burrows must have slipped me something last night and assaulted me. Her body trembled, then shook as deep sobs exploded from her tortured heart, causing her to gasp for air. A sick, churning sensation ripped at her stomach, forcing her into an involuntary fetal position. All of a sudden, the door to the room opened and Millie heard a commotion over her shoulder. She felt nauseous as she froze in fear, unable to move, waiting for Mr. Courtier or Will to come over and attempt to continue their assault. As someone moved onto it, she felt the bed sink. Curling her body into a tight ball, she prepared herself for the onslaught. Millie heard a voice that sounded muffled and echoed like someone yelling down a well. Time seemed to stand still just before she heard her name. "Millie, hon?" She could feel someone or something touching her head. In the dark corner of her mind where she had retreated, huddled in fear, Millie could hear someone calling for her. She heard it through the haze. The voice seemed so distant as it kept pleading, "Millie, come on, baby. Wake up, honey. It's me. Scott. Scott. My husband's name is Scott." Millie screamed out, "Scott," as she opened her eyes and moved to sit up in bed. Her husband's strong, handsome features came into focus inches from her face. Millie threw her arms around him and held on for dear life. "Scott, I never wanted this to happen." Her voice, hoarse from exertion, cracked, "God, why?" With such heart-rending, soul-wrenching emotion, she just let the tears explode. Scott pulled his wife to him, his own tears joining hers, cascading down her face. He kept saying, "It's okay, baby. Calm down and let's talk." His strong voice was calm and in control. Finally, Millie sat up. She looked around the room and saw Mr. Courtier sitting at a small table near the window, sipping what appeared to be a cup of coffee. Millie's face contorted in rage. "How dare you? How could you do this to me? I hate you," she screamed, sobbing as she collapsed back into her husband's loving arms. Scott continued to comfort her as she calmed down. "Millie, I think you need to listen to me for a second. Do you really believe I would allow anyone who had hurt or caused you pain to be near you?" he asked. As Millie looked up at her husband, a bewildered expression of confusion spread over her face. "What do you mean?" she asked while absent-mindedly pushing her hair out of her face behind her ear. After brushing her remaining stray hairs out of the way, Scott kissed her gently on the lips. then informed, "Honey, it was Darren and RJ, who kept Wilboros and Spillman, the bartender, from playing their perv little game on you. It was RJ who watched over you and kept the boys from really pushing the lace drinks to you. In the meantime, Darren tracked me down through the precinct. That enabled some Vice Squad detectives to meet me here and deal with the problem." Millie looked up at her husband, mouth agape. All she could say was, "Who is RJ?" There was a movement near the door to the room, and Scott nodded over his shoulder towards the movement and said, "That would be the cute little blonde cocktail waitress who kept buzzing around you last night." Moments later, the blonde waitress from the night before came into view. She was wearing jeans and a white t-shirt. "Hi, sweetie. Sorry to scare you. I hope you can forgive us for that." Millie let go of Scott to hold out her arms to RJ. While hugging each other, Millie looked over RJ's shoulder at Mr. Courtier before breaking out in an embarrassed blush. Swallowing hard, she apologized. "I'm sorry for what I said. I didn't know and I thought." Darren interrupted by holding up his hand to stop her. "No offense taken. No apology necessary. I was just hoping you weren't going to thrash me," before Scott could explain. He chuckled as he finished talking. Millie just nodded, thinking, "I've never seen him this lighthearted before. It's weird seeing this side of him. He's really a normal human being." She was lost in thought as RJ walked over to Mr. Courtier, then turned and sat in his lap before hugging and kissing him with utter familiarity. Wide-eyed, Millie stared for a moment, then asked, "How do you know each other?" RJ opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Mr. Courtier interjected. "I come over on the night she works and give her big tips. Then she takes me to her house afterwards to personally show her gratitude." Before he could continue, the little blonde slapped him on the shoulder twice. "You are so bad. Why do I put up with you? I do not take you to my house for big tips. I take you home to personally thank you for loving and marrying me. Although, the big tips do help put me in a good mood." Darren chuckled, continuing what Millie now understood was playful banter. "Oh, and all this time I thought it was because I was good in bed." The blonde smiled and then kissed him. "Well, there is that too. That's why you tip so well, to put me in the right mood so you can show your wares and strut your stuff." They both looked back at Millie as Darren said, "Mrs. Millie Albrighton, this is my wife, Mrs. RJ Courtier." Both women nodded and exchanged smiles before cracking up into laughter only a female would understand. Scott and Darren were smiling, but their confusion was obvious. As usual, they were clueless. "Millie, please call me RJ. It's less formal, and I like to keep it that way." Millie replied with a smile. "Thanks, I will." A few minutes after handing her a bathrobe, Scott followed his wife to the bathroom. He closed the door behind them and took Millie in his arms. She was biting her lower lip with obvious fear as she looked up into his face. "Scott, I am so sorry. Please forgive me." Scott looked at the beautiful lady standing before him. "Baby, I love you. There's no need for you to apologize to me for anything." Then kissing her gently, he could taste the tears that started to flow. He leaned against the sink so they could see and hold each other more comfortably. "You made some really bad decisions last night. Fortunately, they didn't end up causing either one of us a lot of grief or pain, but they easily could have. We can talk about everything when you're feeling better. I think we just need to take better care of each other from now on. I do so love you, Millie." Millie held Scott close and said through her sniffles, "I love you too, sweetheart. We can talk tonight. Afterwards, you can show me how much you love me, up close and personal." Scott kissed her again as he replied, "I would love to show you right now, but it will have to wait until tonight. And don't worry, this isn't just another empty promise. We are going to make it happen tonight, even if I have to quit my job. Now take your shower. Your stuff is in the gym bag on the floor. I'll see you in a bit." Millie shivered involuntarily at her lover's comments, then sent him out the door as she got ready for a shower. As Scott left the bathroom, he had a lot on his mind. "I know Millie. She isn't the cheating type. Going to that lounge was a huge error in judgment, even if it was a good setup by Boros. To begin drinking without the other people Boros had supposedly invited was a major blunder. Dancing with the jerk was way out of line. We do need to talk about those things. I know I get focused on the job, and she gets lonely. We just need to tweak our relationship. This was a good wake-up call for both of us. We will take the time to sit down and get all our issues resolved." Scott felt so fortunate to have Millie as his wife. Millie came out a short time later looking refreshed. She found RJ sitting at the small table with breakfast consisting of eggs, toast, orange juice, and hot coffee. "Where are the boys?" she asked. RJ smiled. "Scott is talking to some detectives and Darren has wandered over to the office to finish some odds and ends. The corporate bigwigs don't seem to be very happy about Mr. Boros' idea of fun and games. They've decided to offer him a fast-track option to a career change. Millie thought about what RJ said as she sat down and fixed herself a cup of coffee. Leaning back, she inquired, "May I ask what the main office intends to do with Mr. Boros?" She took a long sip of coffee as she awaited RJ's reply. The cute little blonde cocked her head and a big smile formed on her face as she said, "They canned him, fired his dumb but with prejudice, without even giving him the opportunity to resign. He has now become a national unemployment statistic." "Oh," Millie blushed, her red hair making the glow of her neck and face even more pronounced. "I didn't want to." RJ interrupted her. "Let's see, Boros and Spillman planned on drugging then assaulting you. They are low-life scum." The detective said Spillman is already rolling over on Boros. Seems they've played their sick little game on a few other women and the police are very interested. Hopefully that information and the drink glasses, which should show evidence of the GHB or some other date assault drug they used, will be enough to put them away for a long time. Darren has been watching how Boros operates for some time. Over the last few years, some of the younger married female employees who worked with Darren suddenly resigned after an evening of partying at the lounge in this hotel. The other women never talked to Darren, but since this is where I work part-time, Darren asked me to keep an eye open. I saw some things that weren't kosher, but since no one complained, Darren couldn't do anything. Yesterday, Darren found out Mr. Boros had set up an office get-together with 4 other employees. The only catch being, 3 of those other employees didn't know anything about it. Well, luckily I had been called in to work last night and could watch over you. At first you were sending mixed signals. You were dancing, almost cuddling before you suddenly walked off the dance floor. That was when I was pretty sure you weren't playing along. The reason we kept getting your drinks is Spillman was lacing them all evening, including the 2 untouched ones at your table. They were slick. I was constantly around your table, and that had the 2 of them a bit unnerved. I called Darren, who in turn phoned Scott before coming over to deal with Boros. When Burroughs stepped out to get a room, he and Darren had a bit of an encounter before Darren came in to watch over you. Spillman was obviously agitated when he spotted Darren sitting down at your table with no Mr. Boros in sight. Scott and the vice detectives arrived moments after you passed out. They sorted through all the stories, and I gave them the glasses from your table which I'd been able to hide before they were able to be washed. Spillman was obviously worried. As I was helping Darren get you out the door, I saw him make a beeline for your table. He sure looked upset when he discovered there were no glasses, full or empty. Let's just say, while you were resting comfortably, the idiots were in for a long night of questioning. Now, with Spillman talking, both of them are about to take a vacation at the taxpayer's expense. So you see, Millie, whatever you do, don't waste any sympathy for either of them. What they deserve isn't sympathy. RJ seemed pleased with her rendition of events as she told them to Millie. For her part, Millie just sat in stunned silence. As the full realization sunk in of how close she had come to a nightmarish situation which would have ruined her life forever, tears of gratitude and fear flowed down her face. RJ left Millie alone with her thoughts and sat on the balcony taking in the morning sun. Sometime later, Millie joined her. Leaning against the rail, she said, "RJ, thank you so much for helping me last night. I think I have been on a pity party about Scott's work schedule and just wanted to be around people last night. That will be the last time I ever do anything like that." Flipping her hair out of her face, she continued with a hint of irritation, "I wasn't trying to come on to Will." As she spoke about Will Boros, Millie's voice switched from irritation to one full of venom and her lip curled in disgust, but she continued, "I don't want anyone else. I truly love my husband and he is all I want or need. I'm so sorry I caused all this hub." RJ looked up and softly replied, "Sweetie, you didn't do anything. Will Boros and that idiot bartender Spillman did. You were just another innocent victim they were setting up for their sick perv depravity. You're just lucky I got called in last night, and that Darren has been watching Boros closely for weeks. You were on a crash and burn course last night, Millie, but like the phoenix bird of legend, you rose from the ashes." RJ's face suddenly took on an almost remorseful expression as she continued in a small voice, "You got a relatively free ticket to a second chance." Millie noted that RJ had been very animated in her hand and facial gestures until she started talking about the phoenix bird. She said the last few words in an almost forlorn tone. RJ quickly recovered and Millie asked, "Last night Darren said something about Boros trying to come out of the closet. Then you said earlier Darren had an encounter with him. Well, Boros is so much bigger and works out regularly. I can't imagine Darren getting into a fight with someone like that." The reflection of the sun off RJ's eyes gave Millie the impression they were twinkling as RJ replied, "First off, I'm not sensitive about discussing Darren or his injuries. I understand what you were really asking. How could Darren with his bad leg face off and hope to hold his own against someone such as Wilboros. After Darren was hurt in his last year of college, he had to learn to use a cane. His physical therapist convinced him during his recovery to enroll in martial arts to help strengthen his arms and legs. Darren's sensei taught him how to use his cane as a devastating weapon. He isn't going to win in a prolonged fight, but in a quick or unexpected encounter he can be downright mean. When Darren got here last night, I told him Mr. Boros had gone down the hallway towards the restrooms and the check-in desk. Darren immediately went to find him. After checking the restroom, he eventually found Mr. Boros renting a room for the night. Mr. Wonderful was telling the kid at the front desk he was going to be extremely busy for the rest of the night with his very drunk date. Now, when my hubby walked down the hallway towards the lounge, he did a dumb thing, but it was all Darren could think of at the time. He waited at a water fountain across the hall from an open mop closet, hiding his cane beside his leg. As Wilboros walked by towards the lounge, Darren slammed the metal handle of the cane between the bigger man's legs from behind. Then Darren reached out, grabbed Mr. Boros' belt, at the same time pulling the cane handle back, causing a second trauma to Boros' groin. When Darren told me about his little interaction with Mr. Boros, he said the sound of air rushing from lungs coupled with the surprise, "Oh shit," was very satisfying. Even though Mr. Boros was doubled over from pain, Darren spun him around facing the mop closet. After getting his cane released, which took a few extra violent jerks, he shoved Mr. Boros in. Apparently, Boros' head smacked into the wall pretty hard and he slid onto his knees, face first into a dirty wet mop. Darren turned off the light and shut the door, leaving the dirt bag for someone else to mop up. Both ladies couldn't resist a good laugh at RJ's corny sense of humor. That's where the cops found Boros, disoriented and confused. The detectives are calling the circumstances surrounding Mr. Boros' claim he was assaulted as fanciful. They believe he was a bit drunk, wandered into the closet by mistake, and fell. Millie stared at RJ, then said with a growing giggle, "Trying to come out of the closet, now I get it. But didn't the detectives take Darren's statement? I mean, he could get into serious shit, sorry. I mean, trouble over something like that." RJ had a mischievous grin as she said, "Actually, Scott told the detectives he interviewed Darren and told the detectives my docile little hubby had nothing more to add. Since Boros didn't get a chance to see who did it, he had nothing more to add either." Millie looked at RJ and began laughing. "You two are something else. Thank you again." While studying RJ, Millie was trying to figure out how to word a question. RJ looked up at the younger woman and said, "Go ahead, Millie. What is it you want to ask me?" Millie blushed at being caught. "Sorry for staring. I was just wondering, did you ever go to college? I'm not trying to pry, but you look and act like you could do more than just deal with lounge lizards." RJ giggled. Where to start? Okay, let's see. I have a bachelor's degree in art, which is all but worthless. I guess I could do something else, but ever since I started working at the lounge part-time, I discovered I really like the job and it's a lot of fun. Plus, whenever Darren feels up to it and we can get a babysitter, he drops by and spends some adult time with me. RJ fell silent. From her expression, Millie could tell she was pondering whether to continue or not. "Millie, I am also a silent partner who owns a share of the lounge. My working there allows some quiet oversight in the running of our establishment. A few years back, I came into a small chunk of money. Darren looked around for investment opportunities, and I decided on the lounge. So far, the gamble has paid off. It's proved to be a lucrative investment over the years. I would appreciate if you kept that quiet. None of the other employees, or for that fact, managers, know anything about what you just learned, and I would prefer to keep it that way." In utter disbelief, Millie asked, "You are a part owner of the lounge downstairs, and you work as a cocktail waitress?" RJ had to stifle a laugh at Millie's expression. "Yep, I like to keep my finger on the pulse of the place. I am especially glad that I did with the situation which developed last night. It was very fortunate my bartender didn't know who I was. Enough about that. Are you feeling better now? Head clear?" Millie nodded. "You know, I am just an average girl from a small town not far from here. I went to school, had boyfriends, experimented with sex, bruised my heart on a couple of guys, and met Scott when I was finishing community college. I heard being a cop's girlfriend, or especially one's wife, could be lonely and hard on the nerves. Up until the last few months, things have been fine. Now I just want Scott at home with me. I am scared for him all the time. We never seem to get time off together, and there are times I feel like our lives are just passing by. I'll bet you don't think of things like that with Darren?" RJ smiled weakly, then said, "Let's go to the ladies' room. After that, grab some coffee, and then we'll sit back down so I can tell you a story that will probably shock you." After returning to the deck with their refreshments, RJ sat staring out over the river. It was a beautiful view from the balcony. Millie could sense the obvious tension RJ was feeling as Millie watched her nervously play with her fingers. With her lips pursed, she looked at Millie with an intense, haunting stare. I think it's best to try and tell this in Darren's own words as he has related it to me over the years, RJ said with a deep sigh. In high school, Darren had been good enough to be a starter in baseball and track. He did so love to run. As RJ stopped for a moment to wipe a tear from her eye, Millie realized for the first time she was about to learn the truth behind Darren's injury. From that point on, she slowly became mesmerized as the story mandated her full attention. But he was never going to be offered a scholarship to any college or university, and his parents didn't have the resources for him to attend one of the more expensive, prestigious schools. Instead, he chose a small liberal arts college near Madison, Wisconsin for their business school and cheaper cost, trying to get the biggest bang for his buck, so to speak. RJ continued to speak, but her voice was lost as Millie only heard the words as they began to form a spectacular visual of Darren's story. Darren enjoyed his first 2 years on campus, partying, studying, and happily losing his virginity to one of the few women who came his way. Darren knew his lean runner's build was unlikely to attract any of the A-list girls, but that was okay with him. In high school, many of the real hot babes were too self-centered and money-oriented. He didn't care for their attitudes or have any extra money. Darren figured out in a hurry there were more than enough other girls with the so-called correct attitude to choose from. About 3 weeks before the end of his second year in college, Tanya, his girlfriend of 6 months, introduced him to a cute little red-headed fireball nicknamed Red. She was a freshman who had taken a liking to the group Darren hung out with. Although bubbly and a bit opinionated, she was not at all unpleasant. She even made a few positive comments about Darren's current relationship with his girlfriend. Red told them one night, "I think it's good for different races to date each other." Tanya and Darren couldn't help but laugh before Tanya goaded, "I think he also liked the fact that I was willing to give it up for him." Both girls giggled as Darren blushed a deep crimson. "I like to think it was the first reason that brought us together," he sputtered. Tanya made a hissing sound as she pressed it to her. "This lover is almost too hot to handle." Winking, she gave him a seductive smile. "But you handle it well." Darren's shoulders slumped in defeat as he looked at his girlfriend. "Okay, I do enjoy your special attention too." That had both girls laughing and high-fiving. The rest of the school year went well, wrapping up almost too quickly. Since he and Tanya were going to rent the apartment for another year, the recess gave him the opportunity to go home and make some extra money. He had hooked a summer job as a delivery man for a family friend, or as his dad called it, the pack animal. It was relatively easy and paid well. Upon arriving back at school in August, Darren instantly knew something was amiss when Tanya was waiting for him in the apartment with her arms crossed. If there were any doubts, they vanished with her words, "Sit down. We need to talk." Her tone was pleasant, but not warm, and her greeting was downright cool. Great, Darren thought. Back to the dorms. I was looking forward to a fun partner to share the apartment with for another year. Maybe more? Darren sat down, looked up at Tanya, and said, "Okay, what's up?" Tanya said, "This is weird. When we started the summer break, I was actually looking forward to spending the coming school year with you. But I met someone a couple of days after I got home and, well, we are head over heels in love. I always enjoyed our time together. I can even say I was developing feelings for you, but it wasn't love. At least not like this. So I am backing out of the apartment, but not to worry, I got you a roommate to take my place. Only you don't get special attention from this one. Sorry." Darren was a bit confused. "Who? Do I know him?" "Well, yeah, you know him, only just not too well, and him is named Becca," Tanya replied. "Who?" Darren asked with a look of utter confusion etched on his face. "You know, Becca, Red from last year. We kept in touch over the summer, and she knew what was going down, so she is willing to share the place with you. There are just no special benefits or touching unless she gives you permission. Okay? This way you don't have to lose the place or move back to the dorms." Darren looked at Tanya. "Well, thanks for telling me up front and for finding a replacement. I wish you luck. Hope it works out for you." Tanya bent down and kissed Darren on the cheek, then whispered, "Thanks, baby. I knew you would be okay with it." As she was leaving, she turned and waved. Darren just sat there taking stock of his feelings. It didn't take too long to understand he really didn't love Tanya, but did have some feelings for her. He knew the pain he felt was only his bruised pride from the sting of her unexpected rejection. "She was the best I've ever had," he admitted to himself. "I'm sure going to miss her, but I do wish her the best. She's one fine lady." With a grin, he realized there was a small silver lining to this otherwise dark cloud. Now he didn't have to explain about his little slip with an ex-girlfriend's younger sister at the 4th of July party. Reminiscing about the party, Darren recalled how the younger sister and he talked through the situation the next morning. Both realized it was just a case of alcohol-induced excitement, taking undue advantage of their mutual loneliness. They had no plans to get together again. He remembered how hostile his ex had been after she walked in on them, taking a shower together the next morning. Even though her younger sister was 18 years old, his ex made it sound like Darren was the one who had violated a 14-year-old. Quietly disengaging himself from the argument that pursued, he managed to slip away, leaving the sisters to work things out between them. From the tone of their escalating voices, he knew it was going to take a while. Recalling the aggravation, he sassily said, "Note to self, never again screw sisters under any circumstances." From behind him came, "That's a good policy, but who are you talking about? Tanya only has brothers." Responding with his usual gracefulness to an unexpected voice, Darren jumped, landing on the edge of the couch, flipping it over onto himself when he fell to the floor. Red was laughing so hard she had tears rolling down her face while she helped him get out from under the couch and set it upright. She said, "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. I thought Tanya told you I was already here." Darren, still trying to get his heart back in his chest, replied, "You didn't scare me." When Becca almost went to the floor laughing at his reply, he realized how stupid the answer sounded and was soon laughing with her. Over the next couple of hours, they both outlined their feelings on sharing a place, division of chores, plus individual and joint responsibilities. Darren was very impressed by Becca's way of firmly planting in his mind the fact they were just roommates, not a couple in any way, shape, or form. She did make him tell her about the sisters before letting the subject drop. After he finished the story, she shook her head and replied, "Well, of course, goofball. Everybody knows it not to screw." Over the next few months, until Thanksgiving, Darren and Becca, along with the rest of the gang, hung out and partied together. They both took time to reconnect with old friends and forge bonds with new ones. When not hanging out with friends, Becca and Darren spent a lot of time studying together. Darren also helped his roomie overcome some math and history problems she was struggling with. They occasionally dated others, but neither was able to find someone they really could connect with. A lot of their time together was spent laughing and sharing what was or went wrong with their dates. When everyone got back from Thanksgiving, Darren noticed Becca was always at his side, constantly touching his arm, shoulder, or leg. When everyone got together at the club one night, one of the other guys pointed it out to him. His buddy had noticed Becca made sure she was sitting next to Darren all night, even sitting in his lap at one point. Since there were only 2 days before Christmas break, Darren didn't have time to fully explore his feelings on the matter. But he decided to ask for a phone number to reach her over the holidays, just in case. She seemed quite excited at the suggestion and told him, "You can call me anytime, day or night." Darren thought the comment a bit weird, but was so enamored with the cute little ball of fire, he just passed it off. He called her at least twice a week over the break, and each call got longer while they talked about anything and everything that came to mind. The last call was just after Christmas when he explained, "Hey, just so you know, I'm caught in a problem with the airline. There was a holiday overbooking hitch, and they offered me some primo seats to fly a different day. So I'll be back on the 30th. At least the apartment will have food in the fridge and heat on when you get there." She got quiet for a moment, then replied, "Okay, I'll see you then, but gotta go for now. See you soon." When Darren arrived back at school, he went about making the apartment livable again. After putting Becca's Christmas gift on her bed, he reset the thermostat, then headed off to the store. He knew he was going to be alone over New Year's, so he bought some beer and a bottle of wine. As a gift to himself, he also made sure he had plenty of munchies for the bowl games. After the shopping was completed, Darren restocked the fridge and cabinets before heading for the shower. He intended to hit the sack early and enjoy the quiet. The hot water felt good, and he absent-mindedly wished that spring would get here so he could run again. Even though he now knew he was not a college-level runner, he still liked to run a few times a week. The same applied to baseball. After the coach made it clear he didn't possess the skills necessary to play at collegiate level, he still enjoyed going to the games. Lost in his own little world, he fumbled the soap and bent down to pick it up. Coming back up, he noticed 2 well-toned legs attached to a very nice-shaped body move into the tub. As the girl turned, his vision was teased by the view. He couldn't help but notice a cute little heart-shaped birthmark right above the thigh that seemed to point the way to her hidden treasure. Curiosity forced his eyes higher, but with great reluctance, he just knew in his heart if this wasn't a dream. One of them was in the wrong apartment. As his eyes reached her full red lips, they begged to be kissed. He continued on to stare into light blue eyes shrouded in a gorgeous face framed by beautiful red hair. Shaking his head, he said, "Becca? Yeah, Becca. I missed you a whole lot during break, mister." As she threw her arms around his neck and pulled him down for a kiss. She pulled away from the kiss and purred, "I can tell you missed me too." Yeah, I did, but you said no touching. I mean, we aren't lovers? She kissed him again, then smiled. Touch all you want. Anytime you want, and you're right, we aren't lovers. Yet, it takes a bit more for loving than just a kiss, so use that touchy-feely stuff and get me ready. Becca giggled. Oh, and once we make love, my kid sister is off limits forever. He heard her excited voice. Come on before the shower gets cold. We need to wash off so we can get really messy. Unable to keep their hands to themselves, they finally gave up. Between the laughter and playful banter, they just washed and dried each other the best they could. The rest of the afternoon and early evening was fast hard sex, slow tender lovemaking, and everything in between. Finally, in the afterglow of 4 couplings, they held each other and just enjoyed the special closeness of their new relationship. Darren saw Becca looking up at him and he asked, Not that I'm complaining, but where did that come from? Well, mister, I've got to study to the exclusion of all else. I have been trying to get your attention since the end of October. I tried being more overtly attentive, touching you repeatedly. Have you even noticed how I'm dressed when we are here alone together? Then in December, I decided to get more aggressive. I did my best to make it clear to everyone that you were the focus of my desires. All to no avail, I might add. So, when I found out you were coming back early, I had to scramble to get here too. I figured if you weren't going to make the first move, I would. I'm glad I did. You're good, damn good. Becca said with a smile. Darren sheepishly replied, Hell yes, I noticed all those things, along with the short dresses and half-nighty combos. Trust me, you had me talking to myself a lot of nights. But damn it, I was told by you and Tanya, no touching. Remember? So until you said it was okay, I wasn't about to. I'm glad you finally decided to make the first move, and thanks, you're great too. Becca giggled as the seriousness in his statement warmed her fondness for him. Okay, so now that we both know we want this, are you okay with it? She asked. Oh yeah, Darren shot back with a deep throaty sigh that made Becca giggle again. Darren got a serious look on his face. She touched his nose, then said, All through the first 3 years of high school, I had guys fawning all over me. At first, the attention was cool. After a while, I realized 90+% of them were attracted to my hair, but not to me. They were drawn to the dumb bimbo reputation blonde hair engenders. So my senior year, I went through about 4 different hair colors and found myself happy with this one. Lo and behold, I was suddenly flying under the radar. My dates became fun, not an Olympic hand-slapping event. I kept it this color when I came to college, and I've been able to watch the wolves at work while I looked for a nice guy. That brings us back to you. Thank you. I'll do my best to live up to your standards, Darren grinned. You're welcome. I don't have any doubt you'll treat me right, she quipped. Pausing for a moment, hungry, he asked. Yep, I could eat. What you got in mind? How about pizza? Would that be okay? Let's go. I just realized how hungry I actually am, she replied and kissed him. After getting dressed, they walked with arms around each other to a nearby pizza joint named The Palace and sat talking while chowing down. Deciding to call it an early night, they headed home. Capping off a slow, easy night with a final bout of lovemaking, they lay completely satiated in one another's arms. Darren smiled and said, I haven't felt this connected since last summer. He was talking to himself, a habit Becca had always thought was cute. Becca responded with a yawn, snuggled into him to get a nice, sleeping position and mumbled, Good, at least you stopped seeing your ex's sister. Darren kissed her, and both of them quickly fell asleep. Becca tried to gather her thoughts as she lay awake, watching the ceiling stare back at her. Has it already been 11 months? After Darren decided to take summer classes, I remember how tickled I was when he asked me to stay over with him. Even though he warned me the summer would be brutal and he would need to put in long hours of study to qualify for grad school, I am still pissed. During the spring semester, Darren got so one-tracked if I didn't pester him, he would zone out and forget I was here. I know he took full course loads while I only signed up for one class during each of the summer terms. She paused a moment, regrouping her thoughts before continuing her self-argument. I had to cut back on classes because I had to work. It wasn't an option for me. I had to make more money for the coming year. Everything was cool for the first couple of months, but now summer is almost over. I want to do things with him, but he is always too busy to even talk, let alone go anywhere. When we do talk, it's nothing but a constant nibbling at each other. No, damn it. Now it's just plain old fighting. I'm sorry. I need more attention. We both need to have more fun, and now he's telling me the fall semester is going to be just as bad. She listened to the voice of reason in her head. He's really trying to do well. He just needs time to get through this final summer semester. I think I'm going to take Gwen's advice and go with the gang from the office Friday night. A few drinks and a little dancing would be a nice change from being cooped up 24/7. It will be fun and a great tension relief. At least my best girlfriend is thinking about my mental stability. I'll explain to Darren in the morning. She rolled over and slowly fell asleep waiting for her guy to get home. Darren left the library after midnight again. Making his way back to the apartment, he thought about Becca. Damn it, the faster I try to get through with my studies, the longer it seems to take. I know Becca's fed up. She wants and needs more time with me. Hell, it's just as rough on me. I need more time with her. We both need to put some fun back into our lives and do it together. When she's free, I am knee-deep in studying. When I'm free, she is either working or in class. Saturday morning we need to sit down and talk, work out some time together. Maybe we could go see one of the plays she's been talking about, or at least take in a movie. We have some extra cash put back. That would be a lot of fun, and I am in need of some battery recharging. The main point, just spend some carefree time together, let off some steam. The demand for papers this semester has been horrid. Arriving home, Darren stumbled into bed after setting his alarm for 6. Early day tomorrow, he mumbled, kissing Becca. Cuddling into her, he was asleep in seconds. Becca was up and moving at 8:30 the following morning. She was going to talk to Darren about her plans to go out with the people from her office after work. Walking into the kitchen, she was surprised to find a note on the whiteboard about an unexpected assignment, so Darren had an early start. He had signed off, "Baby, please don't wait up, we can talk in the morning. Love you, D." That was it. Becca lost her grip. She began shouting and crying. Damn it. You're damn right I won't wait up. How much of this do you think I can take? If this is what you think makes a good relationship, well, mister, you have another think coming. I am going dancing tonight, and that's final. If you can ignore me, let's see if you can ignore that. She crossed through his message and tersely wrote, "Out with friends. I'll be really late or at Gwen's if too loaded. See you whenever. Becca." Becca was obviously very hostile when she arrived at the office. Hayden Olson, another student office worker with whom she and Gwen usually shared lunch hour with, followed her to the back. "Hey, you don't look so good. What's going on?" His voice sounding concerned. Becca suddenly realized Hayden was standing closer to her than she liked, but not so familiar to be uncomfortable. Becca couldn't help herself as she began to cry again. "Is Gwen here yet?" she asked. "No," Hayden replied. "She took today off to help set up the club for tonight's party. Can I help, or is this a girls only kind of thing?" One thing Becca had come to appreciate about Hayden, despite his occasional outburst of macho maleness, was the fact he did seem to know when to let the girls talk among themselves. Her increasingly higher-pitched voice gave away her fragile emotions. "No, just peeved at my boyfriend right now. I'm sick and tired of being taken for granted." Suddenly Becca couldn't hold back. Hayden opened his arms and she went to him, sobbing on his chest. She heard Hayden say, "This guy needs to get a grip on reality. What a jerk to do this to you." Becca's heart wanted to tell him he was wrong, that Darren was actually a nice guy. But for the moment her emotions ruled. Her silence agreed with Hayden. After she calmed down, Hayden gently let her go, keeping his hands on her shoulders. Catching her gaze, he touted, "Tell you what, I'll make sure we dance with each other as much as possible tonight. That way you can tell this lunkhead he better get on the stick. You have another guy interested, and you won't be lying, okay?" Becca nervously glanced at his hands on her shoulders. "We'll see about tonight, but for now I have to figure out how to make things right with my boyfriend." Hayden jerked his hands back, holding them up like Becca had a gun. "Sorry, my only expertise is dancing. That's all I have to offer." Becca turned and headed for the girls' room to compose herself. Hayden watched her body as she walked away. Just as she reached the restroom door, he mumbled to himself, "Strange chick. But tonight we'll see if my hands bother her after a few drinks and some close dancing on the dance floor." As she went through the restroom door, instead of stopping when she heard him mumble something, Becca just continued on, choosing to ignore him. Becca felt exhausted. Combined with her slight buzz, she decided it best to crash in Gwen's apartment. As she lay in Gwen's spare bed, she thought back over the evening. "I haven't had this much fun in a long time. The music, the laughter. I think I danced with everyone. I even kept a perfect buzz all night, but never let it get beyond that." As the designated driver, Gwen did a good job of watching over me so nobody got too out of hand. However, I was buzzed enough that I was surprised by Hayden's sudden come on when he got me isolated in the hallway just before we left. I allowed him to kiss me for a moment or two, but when he tried to French kiss me, I pushed him away. He can't kiss anywhere near as good as Darren, and he won't be getting another chance to try either. The no harm, no foul rule I guess applies for now, but I will need to be careful around that one. He is cagey. He slipped through my defenses quicker than anyone I've ever experienced. I really need to talk to Darren today and work out some of these feelings of anger. He really is special to me. I'm just frustrated with him. She looked at the clock. It was 4:30 in the morning. Time to sleep. Darren glanced over at the clock once more. It was 5 minutes later than the last time. He finally just gave up. It was 6 o'clock in the morning, and he was exhausted after a sleepless night without Becca. He began talking out loud to help him think things through. Now what do? I can't give up on school, and I don't want to give up on Becca. God, I wish she would call so I could stop worrying. Why didn't she just talk to me about a night out with some friends? I would have understood, and I wouldn't have worried about her all night. Thinking back to the afternoon before, turns out I'm ruining the grade curve, so my teacher excuses me from finals. So, stupid me. I rushed to finish my last 2 papers, picked up some Chinese takeout, and hurry home thinking I'm going to be in my girl's arms. But, no. All I get is a note on a board saying gone dancing and staying out all night, ending with a flippant threat, see you whenever. He could feel the sarcastic anger rolling off his own answer. Damn it. I told her this semester and the fall term would be hell. Exhaling loudly, he shook his head. I know it might look like I don't care, but she's wrong. She's so neat, so alive. I can honestly say I've never met anyone like her before in my life. She makes me so proud when we're out together, especially since it's me she wants to be with. I need to get away and think for a day or two, cool down, so I don't strike out at her. Maybe I should do some hiking, camp out overnight, and get my head straight. He threw together a backpack with his sleeping bag, some fruit, veggies, and a couple of sandwiches, then filled his 2 Boda bags with water. Cleaning off the kitchen table, he left a note for Becca. Hey babe, I am feeling a bit hostile, and from your note on the board, you probably are too. Worried that if we talk right now, it will become a yelling match with one or both of us saying something we shouldn't. So, I'm hiking over in the state park to clear my head and calm myself. Should be back early tomorrow evening. I know you're the best thing in my life, and I'm sorry for all the disconnects. Darren. Folding it up, he put it in an envelope with Becca clearly written across the front and taped it to the middle of the kitchen table. He headed out to hop a bus to the park. Becca awoke just after noon and followed her nose out to the kitchen where Gwen was reading the paper and having some coffee. Gwen giggled at Becca's disoriented-looking hair. It was all over the place. Pointing to the corner of the kitchen, she said, "Fresh coffee, help yourself." After pouring a cup, Becca took a seat across from Gwen. She was well into her second cup when she looked up at Gwen and said, "I bet I look a fright?" "Compared to what?" Gwen joked. "That bad?" Becca moaned. Nodding as she fought back a giggle, Gwen asked, "Did you finally get your emotional kinks worked out last night? Are we back? Or is your guy still getting skewered? I'm feeling a lot better. Now that I got my fix, maybe we can talk without me biting his head off." "Hey, why don't you two get your heads straight and come over for supper tonight?" Gwen asked. Becca thought for a moment, then replied, "I did kind of drop a bomb in his lap yesterday. Can I use the phone to call him? Maybe gauge what is going on in his head? I know I would have been a bit apeshit myself if I came home and saw what I wrote, especially the 'I'll be back whenever' part." Gwen flashed a pained look at her friend's comment. In the living room. "Thanks," Becca said as she headed for the phone. A few minutes later, Gwen watched as Becca came back with a worried look. She said, "I need to head over to the apartment. Something isn't right. Darren was going to be in all weekend, and there's no answer. Go grab a quick shower and at least comb your hair, then I'll run you home," Gwen said. Becca seemed to be lost in thought, then replied, "Okay," turned and headed to the bathroom. 45 minutes later, the 2 women pulled up in front of Becca and Darren's apartment. Becca was out of the car, up to the door, and inside before Gwen could park. After grabbing Becca's bag, she left in the car. Gwen followed her in. Becca was scared. After calling Darren's name, there was nothing but silence. She quickly checked all the rooms. He was nowhere in sight. Coming in behind Becca, Gwen put her friend's overnight bag and dresses on the kitchen table, then turned to find Becca a bit wild-eyed, looking around the kitchen as if searching for something. "Is everything all right?" Gwen asked. Becca shook her head. "No, I have no idea where he is, but he has been home." "How do you know?" Gwen inquired. Pointing to the whiteboard, Becca responded, "Our messages we left to each other have been erased." As she watched her friend's emotions build, Gwen tried to defuse the situation by suggesting, "Maybe he is studying again?" Before Gwen could finish, Becca pointed to the desk across the room. She shook her head violently. "No, his laptop and all his books are right there. He wouldn't go study without them." The first tears of the afternoon began to fall down Becca's face as Gwen took her friend into her arms to let her cry. For some reason, Gwen had a feeling it was going to be a long night. It was dusk when Darren made it home Sunday night. He was pleasantly tired but not exhausted. Maybe we can go for pizza then talk? I'm glad I went and cleared my head. Noticing Gwen's car in the driveway, he thought, good she's home. I really need a hug. He moved a bit faster, but when he got to the door it was locked. Pulling out the keychain around his neck, he unlocked the door. Looking around inside the apartment, he saw Gwen asleep on the couch, but Becca was nowhere to be seen. As he unloaded his backpack off his shoulder, Gwen jerked awake, her eyes searching for the noise that startled her. Darren was about to greet her when her eyes narrowed into slits as she focused on him. Her face reflected the rage inside as she jumped up and ran at him. As her hand smacked loudly into his cheek, she screamed, "How dare you do this to her? First you disappear for the whole weekend, turning her into an emotional wreck. Then you leave her alone to worry herself sick about where you were. If you were hurt or even alive, no note, no message, no nothing." Gwen's voice was shrill and forceful as she continued the tirade. "I've got a good mind to kick your butt all over the sidewalk, mister. I just got her to sleep a few hours ago. Who the hell do you think you are?" She raised her hand to slap him again. Darren stood in stunned silence for a moment as the ringing in his head subsided from the force of Gwen's slap. Her attack was totally unexpected. As his head cleared, he only heard a few words of her outburst. "No note, emotional wreck?" He saw her raise her hand again, and the anger that flared from deep inside him boiled over. Gwen watched with sickening alarm as Darren's eyes narrowed with contempt, while his jaw clenched and his lips tightened with suppressed fury. He grabbed her raised hand and held it. His voice was low and the hiss of anger obvious as he spoke, "Thank you, Gwen, for your time and trouble helping Becca." Darren felt himself shaking as he fought for control. Looking past the frightened girl to the kitchen table, Darren stated, "I left a note. It was on the kitchen table, which is now covered up with Becca's stuff. It was cleaned off when I left." He watched the fight go out of Gwen as she shrunk back. "I'm going to go get a shower, then I'm going to bed. When I get out of the shower, hopefully you will be gone. I've never hit a girl or woman before. If you're still here when I come out, I can't promise I'll ever be able to say that again." I was calm and ready to talk. "Now I need more time. Thank you so much for your help." The sarcastic snarl was not lost on Gwen. Releasing her hand, Darren moved quickly towards the bathroom door. As Becca flung open the door to her room, she looked up at him with a frantic look on her face and said, "Please." His look of unbridled anger stopped Becca from saying anything else. Spotting the reddening hand print on the side of his face, Becca stared in confusion at Gwen, who was crying while mouthing, "I'm sorry." Looking back up at Darren, she shook her head in disbelief. The look of pure hatred draining from his face was being replaced by one of pain and loss. He whispered in a hoarse voice, "Not tonight, Becca. Maybe tomorrow. I need to calm down again." He looked back at Gwen, then disappeared into the bathroom, locking the door behind him. He moved slowly to the shower and turned it on, and moments later, after discarding his clothes, climbed in, letting his muscles relax in the hot water. After brushing his teeth, he finished his nightly routine. As he quietly exited the bathroom, he heard Becca screaming at Gwen in the kitchen. He glanced at the two of them quickly. "How could you? I have never raised a hand to anyone, and you decide to physically attack him. I know you were upset, we both were, but even though you had to listen to me for a couple of days, you had no right to touch him. Damn it. How did this get so screwed up?" Becca's voice grew shrill, raising an octave as she spoke, her arms wrapped tightly around her body. "Becca, I said I was sorry. I've been on edge all weekend, and I just reacted when I saw Darren." Gwen replied, throwing her hands up in exasperation. "I'm sorry. I really am." Becca shuffled her feet and looked up at Gwen. "I know, I'm pretty sure we all are, but I think it would be best if you go now. Darren and I need to be alone to see if we can dig ourselves out of this hole. I'll call you when things settle down, maybe next week." Darren turned when Gwen reached for her purse. There would be time for "I'm sorry" later. Right now he needed a good night's sleep. He walked a few paces into his bedroom, and he did something he had never done before. He locked Becca out for the night. Falling on his bed, he pulled the sheet over him and passed out. Sometime in the early morning hours, Darren woke up needing to pee. He almost tripped over Becca, who was asleep on a pillow in front of his door, holding tightly onto a blanket in one hand. She had what appeared to be a piece of paper, most likely his letter, in the other. After he got a drink of water and finished peeing, he picked up his girlfriend and carried her into his room. He laid her on the bed, climbed in beside her, and covered them both up. Becca was so exhausted, she barely registered that Darren had her in his arms. Too hoarse from crying to speak, she grabbed onto him, holding on like she was afraid he would disappear. Darren wrapped himself around her to give her warmth. Stroking her head and back to reassure and comfort her, she was soon snoring peacefully. He quickly fell back to sleep once he knew she was all right. Reluctantly, Becca agreed to her parents' request and returned home for Christmas break. As soon as she walked in the door, they could tell their daughter was tremendously distraught. In their sincere desire to help, they were able to convince Becca to finally open up and share her and Darren's problems as she saw them. Over the next few days, they spent several hours discussing, questioning, and observing their daughter, her behavior, and analyzing her answers. In the end, their final conclusion and recommendation was that Becca and Darren probably should separate for a while to clear their heads and get a grasp of their true feelings. Becca's mom and dad felt it would give the young couple some much-needed breathing room to see if they could recapture what they previously had. Considering how the last 8 months had torn at the fabric of her and Darren's relationship, Becca was melancholy. But unfortunately, she had to agree with them. She recalled, "Darren kept warning me the summer and fall quarters were going to be brutal. I just didn't realize how much. But did he really have to spend over 70 hours a week between classes, library, and study groups? I tried to figure out little ways we could be together, like meeting him at the library with dinner, or joining him there to do my studies." She remembered fondly how much they had poured into each other for the 5 weeks between summer and fall classes. She really felt they had turned a corner. His comment to her the morning after the blow-up in the apartment with Gwen had set her heart aflame. She woke up on his bed with him wrapped around her after falling asleep in front of his bedroom door. It was stupid, but she was distraught and did not know what else to do. She had asked him, "How did I end up in bed with you?" He had sheepishly replied, "I got up to use the bathroom and found you on the floor. No matter how mad I was, I care too much to allow you to suffer like that. So I picked you up, put you in bed, and snuggled up with you." Becca realized that was as close as he had ever come to saying he loved her. Of course, she hadn't come out and told him how she felt either. She had promised herself she wouldn't say that to anyone until she was sure, especially after telling that to one guy in high school, then quickly realizing she didn't love him shortly after they broke up. Her relationship with Darren was so confusing. When her mom asked if she loved him, she wouldn't say yes, but she also couldn't say no. The last semester had reset the stage and taken its toll. The constant strain proved to be too much, causing the little nitpicking fights about the stupidest things to start all over again. Her mother had always told her, "Be sure to pick your fights wisely. Too much goodwill is wasted fighting over nothing." Did she heed the lifelong advice? Of course not. Now she wondered, why didn't I listen to her? Becca had learned one thing about the stunt she pulled when she went out that Friday night. She now understood why Darren was so upset, finally realizing she would have been too if he had done something similar to her. The next 2 times she went out dancing with the work group, it was discussed with Darren several days beforehand. She also called him as soon as they returned to Gwen's house afterwards. Both times after she had been drinking, Hayden tried to get her to play, but she was ready and forcefully told him loud and clear, "Stay away from me." Becca made it very clear she was in a relationship and didn't need his stupid macho games. Although indignant, he had backed off. He turned his attention to playing one of the younger girls in the office. Her name was Gabby, short for Gabrielle. She always seemed to be one step off of the bimbo bubble. But, Becca reminded herself, even though I was true to my guy, I didn't support him fully either. I wonder if I am even capable of having a mature relationship? When Becca returned to campus, she quickly packed her things and moved into her dorm room. She left a letter and a check covering her half of the expenses for the remainder of the school year so Darren wouldn't have to worry about giving up the apartment. Before she closed the door, she stared wistfully one last time at her door key left on the kitchen table. As she drove away, she couldn't help but cry and didn't stop for 2 days. Separating from Darren was one of the most emotionally painful things she had ever done. It was going to be a long 2 months. Darren came back to school psyched up. He had spent Christmas vacation thinking through the last few months. Boy, have I been a dumb shit. My sole focus has been on school. Looking back now, I realize I could have split the time with Becca and still done well in school. I hope she will let me make it up to her. Expecting her to be there, he yelled out as he entered the apartment, "Becca, baby, where are?" He began to tremble when he saw her house key on the kitchen table. His fingers lost their grip as his suitcase effortlessly slipped to the floor as he ambled towards her room. Just as he feared, everything was gone. While fighting back tears, he proceeded to unload his car, trying to keep himself busy. Once he had finished unpacking and putting his stuff away, he closed and locked the front door. After removing his coat and gloves, he sat at the table, took in a deep breath, then let out a long, slow sigh as he picked up the key. Glancing around the room, His eyes settled on the envelope, taped to the whiteboard with his name written in Becca's gently flowing script. Afraid to take it down, even more afraid to read its contents, he sat just staring at it. He just knew in his heart that she was out of his life forever. This wasn't what he wanted. It might be deserved, but it wasn't what he wanted. For some stupid reason, as he hung his head, the lyrics to an old song came to mind. "'Cause I need you more than I needed before. And now where I'll find comfort, God knows. 'Cause you left me just when I needed you most. Left me just when I needed you most." He couldn't stop thinking about all the things he wanted, needed, should've said to her. Staring out the kitchen window at the gathering darkness, he realized his mind was going through mental shook. But it didn't help. None of his thoughts at the moment were all that coherent. With the daylight all but gone, he walked over and turned on the hood light over the stove. Then, with no previous intention, he found himself standing in front of the board, just staring at it again. With a sigh of resignation, he reached out and jerked the envelope down. After picking up a knife from the counter, he threw a leg over one of the kitchen chairs. Darren just stood listlessly looking at the envelope in his hand as he straddled the seat. With a deep breath, he finally plopped down. Darren sat tenderly tracing the edge of the envelope as if it somehow were part of Becca. Realizing he was only delaying the inevitable by fictitiously hoping the contents would somehow miraculously soften, he took the knife and ran it underneath the flap, opening the envelope. He knew it had to be bad. If it was good, she would be there instead of the letter. While pulling out the contents, a check for a goodly amount of money came sliding out from inside the letter. Now his curiosity overcame his fears. He opened the letter the rest of the way and began to read. "Darren, please believe me and understand, as difficult as this is for you to read, it's been just as painful for me to write. My heart is so torn. I wish I had the wisdom to make our relationship better, but I don't. The past 2 semesters have been so difficult for us. I know you needed to get through them with your best possible effort. Believe it or not, I am so very proud of how well you did. But I am not as focused on school as you. I wanted, needed, more attention than you were able to provide. I'm sorry, but I am selfish when it comes to the guy I am attached to. This may sound weird seeing as how I have moved out of the apartment, but I need to tell you that I have more feelings for you than I have ever had for any guy in my entire life. Funny thing is, I am pretty sure you feel the same way about me, or I am deluding myself completely. So I am asking for some time apart to clear our heads. I am hoping you will give me the space of a few months to see how we feel about one another. If after spring break you still want to get back together, we can talk about things and hopefully reestablish the relationship. If we really care for each other, then it will happen. If not, then the time apart will prove correct. All I know is I miss you bad. But right now we probably wouldn't survive because I would nitpick everything to death. You deserve much better than that. When the time comes, I truly hope we can salvage what we had from what it has become. With all my heart, Becca. P.S. I knew finding a new roommate would be literally impossible. The check is for my part of the rent and utilities for the remainder of this semester. The last thing I would want is for you to have to give up our apartment. Darren reread the letter 2 or 3 times before putting it down. He braced his elbows on the table as he buried his face into his hands, softly whispering as he cried, "Now I can say it, Becca. I love you. All my doubts and fears are gone. Why did it take losing you to make me understand? I feel so empty and lonely. Please come back." Knowing Becca well, Darren realized that if there was a real chance, he would have to wait 2 months until spring break. At the same time, Darren knew in his heart he wouldn't give up trying to find Becca and convince her to change her mind. Over the next few days, Darren's moods shifted between morose and anger. He tried to find out which dorm Becca had moved into, but with no luck. Darren developed a habit of dropping by different places she used to frequent sometimes when the gang got together, but their friends said Becca was a no-show. While checking out her workplace, he ran into a young man wearing a name tag that said, Hayden Olson. Darren asked him if he knew a female employee named Becca. Since Hayden had overheard Becca telling Gwen about the separation, he lied to Darren. "It's my understanding she no longer works here. I know for a fact she left before the holidays and hasn't returned. Pretty sure she turned in her resignation and quit." As he was leaving the office, Darren didn't see the sinister smile on Hayden's face. Darren tried calling the student housing office to see if they could get a message to Becca. The 2 women he talked to had been polite, but adamantly refused to give him any information. "I will try and get a message to her that you called," one of them had finally told him before she abruptly hung up. He had the impression they weren't overly sympathetic to his plight. Darren had a similar response when he contacted Becca's parents. They were sympathetic, but made it clear they felt it was Becca's responsibility to make contact if that is what she desired. All he wanted was the chance to talk this out with Becca and see if he could change her mind. As the semester started, he wished he had paid more attention to what classes Becca had mentioned she was going to take this semester. He might have been able to catch her in one of her classes. Totally frustrated, he began to resign himself to the fact it wasn't going to happen. Due to the increasing demands of his own classes, he was finally forced to accept the situation and get serious about studying before his grades began to suffer. Darren settled into an uneasy schedule of school, study, and bare existence. His normal winter doldrums seemed amplified by the stark emptiness of the apartment. He began to sleep on the couch because the bedrooms held too many memories. It turned into a long, cold winter without the warmth and comfort that Becca had brought into his life every day since they had become a couple. Becca had become reclusive and very careful of who she confided in. Her decision to stay away from Darren for a couple of months didn't seem like such a good idea now. She realized if she had only been willing to live like this when Darren was buried in his studies, probably none of this would have happened and they would still be together. Once spring break was over and they were back together, she would put up with whatever was necessary to not only help Darren, but also to show him how much she loved and supported him. A few weeks into the semester, Gwen cornered Becca one afternoon after class. "Becca, I'm worried about you. I've watched you isolate yourself in that little dorm room and waste away. Girlfriend, you need to get out and be with people. You're not wired to be a monk. I want you to spend more time at my apartment, even if it's just weekends, so I can keep an eye on you. Also, if this separation is supposed to be to evaluate your relationship with Darren, don't think you need to see other guys during this time?" Becca looked at her friend who had been so instrumental in both last August's big blowout fight with Darren and at the same time the rock for her own sanity during the semester that followed. "When I really don't want to be around other people right now. I am hurting and licking my own wounds." Gwen raised and lowered her eyebrows several times as she replied in a joking tone full of insinuation, "Oh, do tell." Laughingly, Becca slapped Gwen on the arm. "Don't give me any of your crap. I don't need it. You don't swing both ways and neither do I." Both girls giggled loudly. Then Becca resumed with a note of sadness in her voice and tears building in her eyes. "When I don't want to date anyone else, I have no desire to be around anyone but Darren. Our only problem, we were ready to self-destruct and I needed to be away from him to give us the space to get our heads straight. But I'll come over to your place on the weekends from now on so I can get some people interaction. But no guys, okay?" Gwen smiled at her friend. "Yep, it will be fun. Even my company is better than none." Becca was stressing as spring break approached. She knew what she wanted, or more to the point, who she wanted. Her school schedule hadn't been all that tough when she signed up last semester, or so she had thought. Turned out 2 of her classes were being taught by PhD candidates, who unlike her other professors were trying to impress their advisors at their students' expense, at least homework and time-wise. It just plain sucked. Not only were there no extra credit options, but the grading curve had a rather steep angle. So, although she had passing grades, she was stressed trying to keep them. Hayden, whether intentionally or unintentionally, was adding to her tension level. She was forced to change jobs at work in order to get away from his constant little comments and touches. Even though she made it perfectly clear and even reported him to their supervisor, he was still trying to get her to date him. She knew from his comments and bragging around the office, any date with Hayden would be equivalent to sleeping with him the way he talked about it. Darren had marked off the days till spring break because it appeared any hope of seeing Becca wasn't going to occur until it then. He mused to himself while loading his car. "Being at the top of my classes ended up having one good perk. I got excused from all 4 of my midterms. Damn, I get almost 20 days off. The only downside, I sure wish I was spending them with Becca. Shit, sometimes life can really suck." As he left for the last major school break before graduation, his mood lightened considerably. He was focused on a single objective, getting the girl he loved back into his arms. Singing to his favorite CD, he drove off campus. It was the Saturday before spring break when Becca unexpectedly showed up at Gwen's apartment in a hysterical state. Gwen soon found herself holding Becca as she sat sobbing and shaking violently. "Okay, Becca, calm down, tell me what happened." Gwen was trying to comfort her, but Becca's outburst had Gwen's nerves on edge also. It took her almost 2 hours to calm down enough to talk. When Becca finally moved away from the comfort of her friend's arms to sit up, Gwen quickly went to get a bottle of water and aspirin for each of them. Gwen sat down and waited until Becca had taken a couple of the white tablets and drank some water before she asked, "Now do you feel good enough to talk about it?" Becca nodded her head and licked her lips. Her mouth still felt dry. Looking at Gwen, Becca replied, "When we were at the club last night, I was having fun dancing with the guys and girls who came by. You were right, I needed the interaction to recharge my batteries to get ready for my talk with Darren after the break. I was laughing at you using every trick known trying to get that tall guy's attention. Since you left the club at the same time, I assume you finally found some common ground? Yeah, we have another date Tuesday. He made me smile a lot last night. Becca tried to force a smile, but failed as she continued. Well, as you know, I wasn't drinking alcohol, so I was comfortable on my own. The guys and girls at the table were keeping our drinks refilled. I trusted everyone, so I wasn't worried about anything. About an hour after you left, I started to feel funny, and shortly thereafter I lost track of everything until I woke up about 4 hours ago. I was in a strange bedroom and in bed with somebody. It was obvious from the irritation when I tried to move that I had sex with somebody. Gwen, I was so scared it made me sick to my stomach. When I got out of the bed, thankfully there was a bathroom off the bedroom, because I lost everything from the night before. Afterwards, I checked for evidence of assault. I began looking for my clothes and quickly got dressed. As I tried to sneak out, a hand grabbed my arm and I screamed in fright. Twirling, I found myself looking into the gloating eyes of Hayden Olson. He grabbed my face and forcibly kissed me as he spouted off, "Now you're mine, witch. I finally claimed you. Get going and be here Monday night for our next session. You were okay last night, a little too laid back, but I expect you'll perform better next time." Jerking away from his grasp, I yelled, "You scumsucker! How could you?" I grabbed my purse and ran to the living room. "See you Monday," he shouted as I fled out the door. I can still hear that rat-faced scumsucker's sarcastic laugh just before the door slammed shut behind me. When I got outside, I walked for a while because my car wasn't anywhere in sight. Finally, I got to a bus stop and eventually back to the club. Thankfully, my car was in the lot. After getting back to my room, I showered 3 times and I can still feel his slimy touch. I went to Darren's apartment first, but he wasn't home, so I came here. I'm sorry, I just had to talk to someone. I feel so dirty, so used, so violated. The bad part is I can't do shit about it. The wipe obviously used a protection every time he had his way with me. Honestly, Gwen, I feel as though I'm trapped in some bittersweet nightmare. Should I regret or be thankful that he used protection? I don't have a shred of evidence, but at least I'm clean and shouldn't have to worry about an STD or worse, a pregnancy. The worst of it, I truly have no one to blame but myself. When you first mentioned and invited me to go to the club with you, I knew from overhearing people at work that Hayden was going to be there. I knew in my heart I shouldn't go. Not with all the trouble he has been causing me at work and his constant remarks and attempts to get me to go out with him. With you there and all my other friends, I overrode my better judgment and thought I could handle the situation. Why didn't you tell me about your concerns? I would never have left you there. Gwen inquired. Hayden hadn't said or done a thing all evening. He was sitting 4 or 5 tables away with his 2 buddies. My guard was down. I was just relaxing and enjoying the interactions with everyone, Becca sniffed. Gwen immediately responded, "Surely you're not trying to blame yourself for being drugged and assaulted. It wasn't something you could have foreseen." "No, but I have to ask myself why I was out trying to have fun with other people when the only person I truly want to be with is Darren. If I had stayed home and waited for our talk, or at least contacted him instead of going out, this would never have happened. There seems to be no end to my selfish behavior. So who do I blame? Hayden is an a-hole and an assaulter, but I'm the idiot who provided him with an easy target," Becca sobbed as she began to cry again. With her head in Gwen's lap, Becca cried out her pain while Gwen did her best to soothe her. As she calmed down, Becca asked, "Do you think I am truly worthy of someone like Darren? Even though I love him with all my heart, I just seem to keep messing up our lives. I don't want to hurt or cause him any more pain. Do you think it would be best if I just walked away and let him get on with his life? Especially after this?" Softly and quietly, Gwen replied, "Girl, there is no one more worthy. If he can't forgive poor judgment, then he's doomed to a life of lonely misery. I've never met anyone who makes perfect decisions. That man needs you. He needs your love and devotion. You owe it to yourselves to make your lives as fantastic as possible. That will only happen if you two are together. It's time for you to consider going home, and I don't mean to your parents. Actually, if you are going to blame someone, then blame me. I'm sorry. All this occurred because I pressured you into going out. If I had kept my mouth shut and let you do what you wanted, just to stay at home waiting for Darren, none of this would have happened." Gwen apologized with tears flowing down her cheeks. I just don't know, Becca said as her voice slowly drifted off into a fitful sleep. Finally, after getting her friend to sleep, Gwen made a decision and tried to call Darren 3 or 4 times over the next few hours, but no one answered. Gwen knew it was going to be another one of those long weekends, and Becca was correct. Hayden had gotten away with somehow drugging and assaulting her. There wasn't anything anyone could do about it. Damn it to hell. This is when I wish I had at least a little meanness. I'd get a gun, hunt that SOB down, and shoot him myself. She angrily thought to herself, hell, I'd even pay someone to do if I only knew anyone who would. With exasperation, she felt, it's hell being nice all the time. Darren returned 2 days early, filled with anticipation and hopes of seeing Becca. He desperately wanted to talk with her, to tell her how he felt. He needed her back in his life. Their separation had made his love more intense, a fact which almost made their time apart unbearable. She just had to feel the same way. The alternative was unthinkable. He could not stand to lose her. Because he couldn't find Becca, the 2 days proved to be a mistake. Living in the apartment with all of its ghostly recollections only served to painfully refresh agonizing hours of memories. The first day back to class, Darren was at his wit's end. Still no word from Becca. He was beginning to wonder if it was over. Had he lost her for forever? Just as he was leaving his final class for the day, he heard someone call out, "Darren!" Stopping and looking around, he could not spot anyone he knew. Shaking his head, he turned to go. There was a tug on his arm, and he looked down into a very familiar pair of light blue eyes staring back up at him from beneath a head of blonde hair. After taking a couple of seconds to fully focus on the pretty face in front of him, he realized it was Becca. Only she wasn't a redhead anymore. She was her natural blonde again. Good Lord. She looked even more beautiful. The change in hair color completely changed the way she looked. It was like staring at a supermodel. Darren wondered why he was shaking as he tried to pull himself together. "I like the hair now that I've seen it," Darren nervously muttered. "I was hoping you would. I did it for you." She smiled up at him. "Boy, does he look good," ran through her mind. Catching herself, she said, "I'm sorry I didn't call last night. I hope I didn't upset you. But my plane got in real late, so I decided it was probably best to wait. I wasn't sure of your schedule, but I figured you would be in the business college sooner or later. If not, I was going to stake out the apartment after my last class. Darren, I'd like to talk to you later in the comments, maybe about 7:30. We need to talk about a lot of things, and I'd like it to be in a neutral setting, at least to start with. If things go like I think they will, I have something I need to tell you when we are alone." She nervously wet her lips before continuing, "And Darren, I've missed you." Up until that moment, Darren hadn't been sure where the conversation was headed. Becca's little come-on smile, and the fact she had missed him said a lot. He was now relaxed and no longer shaking. He smiled back and said, "I've missed you too, Becca. 7:30 will be fine. I'll see you then." At his words, Darren watched her eyes light up as a tear trickled down her face. He wiped it off her cheek and whispered softly, "Yeah, I'll definitely be there." Becca felt a shiver go through her body at his touch. She turned and began to walk away. She knew if she didn't, she might take him down right there in the hallway, and neither of them could afford to be expelled. Moving off in the other direction, Darren looked back over his shoulder, almost running into a pole. Having glanced back at that precise moment, Becca couldn't help but chuckle as she turned back, lost in her own little world. Becca didn't notice a pair of eyes burning a hole in her back as she turned to walk away. Those eyes were filled with malice and hate. Hayden bent down and whispered something in the ear of the pretty little co-ed under his arm. As he pointed at Darren, she nodded, and as they walked off together, Hayden had that sinister smile on his face again. Arriving early, Becca sat in a booth near the front entrance of the Commons. In her mind, she was mentally rehearsing what she wanted to say to Darren. Her desire for everything to be perfect had her anxiously readjusting herself on the hard bench every few minutes. Her mouth was dry, and she had already drunk 1 bottle of water. Her nervousness showed as she kept thrumming her fingers and playing with her empty water bottle, tapping it on the table. Darren came directly from the library, entering through the back door at 25 after 7. He was nervously searching for Becca. The throng of students not only blocked his way, but made it difficult to see very much of the Commons. As he stood there, 3 big frat guys moved in front of him, and he half listened to them, frustrated at his inability to move further into the building. One of the 2 goons blocking his way asked the 3rd guy who was standing in front of them, "Okay, just why are we here again?" He heard a voice he thought he recognized reply, "Okay, one more time. My woman is sitting over by the door waiting for her former boyfriend to show up at 7:30. She is going to tell him she doesn't want to ever see him again. We have a signal worked out if the guy gives her any shit. Since we became lovers a few weeks ago, she can't get enough of me. For that matter, she loves what I do to her body, and I have to admit, I love what she does to mine. She is one hot mama who seems to be excited all the time. Hell, I can still see that cute little heart-shaped birthmark just above her thigh." God, she loves sex. I've been promised her for the first time tonight. That's my reward for helping her get shithead out of the way. There. See the little flip of her bottle? That's the signal she wants to talk to me. The guy hidden from Darren's view said. Darren looked around the bigger of the two guys, his eyes searching for a girl with a bottle. His knees went weak, and he suddenly felt nauseous as his stomach lurched. The girl by the front door with the bottle in her hand was Becca, but he already knew it would be. He knew of no other girl with a cute heart-shaped birthmark pointing the way to her thigh. As Darren watched, the guy with the familiar voice started towards Becca's booth. Darren immediately recognized Hayden from Becca's work. What the hell's going on? Darren wondered with a sickening lump in the pit of his stomach. A lump that rapidly increased in size as Darren watched Hayden stride across the floor and bend over Becca's table, blocking his view of Becca but leaving no doubt they were face to face in deep conversation. The lump reached epic proportions as Darren could tell Hayden leaned in for what was obviously not only a kiss but a long one. Even though he couldn't see Becca, Hayden's body language left no doubts as to what was happening. He felt as if the room were suddenly spinning. No, she was setting me up today, just leading me on so she could rip out my heart again. Darren knew he had to get out of there before he collapsed. He pushed past the guy in front and then did a U-turn out the back door. His pulse was racing as he staggered to his car. Sitting in the gathering darkness, all he could hear was his pulse pounding loudly in his ears. His own private gloom threatened to overwhelm him as he tried to make sense of Becca's actions. He leaned his head on the steering wheel and cried. It wasn't a manly thing, but he hurt so bad. It felt as if a knife had sliced his heart and soul open. Inside the Commons, Becca kept looking at the clock and the front door. It was 8:15, and there was no sign of Darren. A deep sense of rejection and loss began to gnaw at her heart while sharing space with the anger and resentment over what Hayden had just said and tried. Her frustration with Hayden boiled quickly into anger as he had come over to her booth, all smiles. His comment that she evidently knew he was going to be there and was waiting for him was nothing compared to her anger at his attempt to lean in and kiss her. She had turned her head and angrily demanded that he leave immediately. Hayden just leaned into her ear and whispered, "I will always be here with you, that you can count on." Becca had reacted with a threat, "Get your butt out of my face and don't ever come near me again, or I will scream for security." Hayden had just laughed as he slowly turned and walked away. Shoving her anger aside, Becca whispered to herself, "Please, Darren, don't do this to us. I'll crawl back if I have to, but it would be so much better if you asked me." The first tear rolled down her beautiful face and onto the table. She felt it wouldn't be her last of the evening. Hayden had watched with smug satisfaction as Loverboy pushed past his two friends, then reversed himself and ran out the door. As soon as the door clicked shut behind him, Hayden discreetly pointed to a co-ed who was standing alone by the front door. She nodded, then quickly exited the Commons, catching sight of her target, staggering towards the parking lot. The co-ed moved after him and saw him get into his car. Hayden had hoped Loverboy would come through the back door so he could play with the idiot's head, but either way his plan would have worked. Looking back towards the front door, Hayden watched his little blonde conquest fidget in her seat until 8 o'clock, then slowly pick up her things to leave. He could tell Becca was crying. "I told you when I claimed you no one else better come sniffing around my property. Looks like a little lesson is going to be necessary," he thought, smiling to himself. Darren sat in his car for a long time, hoping this was all just a nightmare and that he would soon wake up. His nerves were stretched so thin, his heart almost stopped from the shock of a soft knock on the driver's window. Realizing someone was standing next to the car, he composed himself and rolled his window down. A soft female voice said, "Darren, hi. I'm so glad I caught you. Sure hope this isn't a bad time, and you can help me. I'm in your art class and have a big problem. I lost the instructions for the project we need to complete. Do you happen to have a copy I could borrow?" Looking back at the Commons, he spoke with an almost robotic tone. "Yeah, get in. I have a copy at my place I can give you." She had a bright, cheery smile, but her attitude seemed strange as she almost purred, "That would be perfect. Just great." Even though it was a nice spring evening, the girl had on a lightweight poncho and an oversized beret. As she got in and buckled up, Darren mumbled to himself, "I guess I'll never understand fashion." It took Darren 5 minutes to drive across campus to his apartment. The young co-ed hopped out of his car and walked up to the door with him. Darren allowed her to enter first, and then closed the door behind them. The only light on in the apartment was a small table lamp he used as a nightlight. "Give me a minute. I need to use the bathroom, then I'll get the notes. Have a seat and I'll be right back," he said as he disappeared into the bathroom. When the door shut, the young girl glanced through some mail on the coffee table. While nervously keeping a watch on the bathroom door, she quickly wrote down the address from one of the envelopes on a small notepad and pushed it into her pocket. She noticeably relaxed and picking up a catalog sat down on the couch. It took Darren longer than expected. As he emerged from the facilities, he said, "Sorry." The girl on the couch lazily replied, "No problem, take your time. All I have to look forward to is homework." He flipped on his bedroom light, quickly glancing through the stack of papers piled on his mattress until he found the project outline. Turning on the light in the living room where his computer was set up, he ran her a copy on his printer. A few minutes later, he opened the front door. "Okay, let me grab my keys, and I'll drop you off by the dorms." Putting her hand on his arm, she kissed him on the lips and said, "I'll be fine, it's really a nice night for a walk. You saved my butt with this copy. I owe you big time. See you in class." She hopped down the stairs and almost skipped down the block, disappearing into the darkness. Darren watched her go. "Weird girl," he said to the night, shrugging as he closed the door. Feeling totally lost, he sat down trying to figure out what he was going to do next. As the young lady in the beret moved quickly out of sight, she made a call on her cell. Fishing the notepad out of her pocket, all she said to the person on the other end was, "His address is 1821 Hillside Drive." "Yes, he's there now." "Great. See you tomorrow." "Count on it." The male voice on the other end replied before hanging up. The girl put her phone away, singing to herself as she started walking merrily towards her dorm. She didn't even notice a car with its lights off pull slowly out of the street she had just passed and turn the other way. Becca was crying as she walked to her car. It was almost 5 after 8. Suddenly she was fuming. "Damn it," she almost screamed. "You are not going to do this to us, Darren Courtier. We are going to talk tonight one way or the other." Sitting in her car in the Commons parking lot, she called his apartment twice with no answer. Determined, she was soon parked across the street in front of Darren's apartment. His car was in the driveway, and the only light on was the small lamp in the dining room. Becca's heart soared. He must have fallen asleep, missing their meeting. She was reaching for her door handle when a light came on in Darren's room. "Goodies up, I'll surprise him when he comes out to the car." Just as she was putting the finishing touches on her makeup, the door to the apartment opened and Becca watched Darren and a young girl step out. The light was too low to see her clearly, and the poncho she was wearing hid her body features, but Becca swore she had seen her before. Becca's world suddenly turned upside down with no way to make it better. Right before her eyes, the girl was kissing Darren in what appeared to be a very familiar way. As the girl took off skipping down the block in an obvious great mood, Becca's heart collapsed, exploding into a million pieces. Her only thought was, "Oh God, I've lost him because of my own foolishness." Her throat suddenly tightened up when her pain began to feel unbearable. She could barely see as her eyes filled with tears. Becca was shaking so badly, she didn't know if she could even drive, but knew she needed to get away from there. The sobbing broke out before she could react. Becca knew she probably couldn't make it to Gwen safely. She started the car and slowly moved towards the road leading to dorm parking. At least with the doors locked, she would be safe there. As she made the left turn onto the main campus road, Becca was still crying so hard, she didn't even notice the car or its 3 occupants driving slowly in the other direction with their lights still off. Darren sat at his dining room table staring at 6 sealed envelopes containing unsent letters he had written to Becca over the last 2 months. With just weeks to go before receiving his much-cherished degree, he truly began to wonder what all the big deal had been about. Too late, he now understood getting the degree was important, but only in regards of being able to provide the best possible life for himself and the person he loved. With his heart in turmoil, he realized, in his zest for achievement, he had taken for granted and lost the most precious prize of all. Becca had slipped right through his fingers. How was he supposed to go on? It felt as if his world had totally ended. A soft knock on the door jerked him out of his reverie of self-indulging pity. For a moment he thought Becca, then realized it was probably his classmate back looking for the ride he offered. As he opened the door, a fist caught him flush on the bridge of his nose. He stumbled backwards, tripping over the couch and falling to the floor. His eyes were watering and his face was smeared with blood. He could taste it in his mouth. There was noise everywhere as someone kicked him in the kidney. He heard a voice say something about his property, then more blows to his head and stomach. Then he felt a kick to his head, as a sudden extreme pain exploded in his left hip and leg. He screamed in agony. Then all was blackness. Becca woke up sometime in the early morning hours, her hair a mess, her eyes puffy, and her nose stuffy. She wanted to just roll over and die. The pain in her gut was that bad. She needed to talk to Darren, find out why he had been so cruel. All he had to say was, "I can't. I have a girlfriend or a date." It would have hurt, but she would have understood. Becca looked at her watch. It was 3:30 a.m. Her mouth felt so dry and raw, she felt in dire need of some water and throat lozenges. Sitting up in the seat to get her bearings, she found herself in the freshman parking lot. Becca used some tissues she dug out of the glove box to straighten herself up, then drove to an all-night convenience store. After leaving there, she drove to a hilltop in the center of the campus. Feeling better from sucking on a cough drop, Becca tried to find some comfort as she sat staring into the night. How was she supposed to face a world without Darren, without her goofball? By sunup, she felt calm enough to talk, but as she drove to Gwen's, Becca became angry. The more she drove, the more hostile she became. Slamming her fists into the steering, she screamed, "Damn you! Damn you! You aren't going to treat me this way. You aren't going to treat us this way." She began cursing and cussing, as her grandpa used to say. Her mind was aflame with how cruel his actions were, yet she knew in her heart he could never be cruel to her. Suddenly changing direction, a few minutes later she pulled into Darren's driveway, parking behind his car. When she turned off the engine, she looked at her old apartment and lost all her bravado. Instead of anger, she began to feel very small and frail. She didn't know why, but she realized she was still willing to work things out if Darren wanted to. No, that was a lie. She knew why. She loved him. That was reason enough to work this out. It was time to get everything out in the open and on the table. She loved him with all her heart, and that wasn't going to change anytime soon. It wasn't until she stepped out of her car and started walking towards the door that she realized something was wrong. First, she noticed his car had been keyed, not just a single line, but multiple lines and curves. As she walked around the car, she discovered both sides, the trunk, and the hood had been keyed repeatedly. Concerned, she started up the steps to the apartment when she noticed the front door was open a few inches, and there was a partial footprint on the top step. It looked like it was made with brown red ink or dried blood. Suddenly, all her problems with Darren seemed trivial as fear knotted in her stomach, making her feel faint. Regaining enough composure in spite of her now uncontrollable trembling, she moved slowly towards the open door. In the early morning light, she could just make out a shape lying on the floor, but it wasn't moving. She was shaking so badly she could hardly move forward. Tears filled her eyes again as she slowly pushed open the door until it hit something and stopped. A low gasp escaped her lips, followed by a blood-chilling scream. Becca's hands went to her head as terror gripped her heart. There on the floor, laying on his right side, facing away from her in a pool of blood, was Darren. Spinning around, she sailed down the steps and, falling to her knees, she emptied her stomach onto the lawn. Becca didn't remember screaming the second time, or pulling her cell phone from her pocket. The next thing she remembered was sitting numbly on the ground, desperately trying to get the 911 operator to understand her rambling dialogue. "He's here. He's dead. Please God, don't let him be dead. Oh God, where is the ambulance?" Seconds later, some joggers, 2 guys and a girl, who heard her screams, came running up to see what the problem was. They immediately pitched in, trying to help in any way they could. The girl went to Becca and held her. Becca was soon clinging to the girl, who instantly became her life ring in a churning sea. One guy went inside to look over the scene while the second guy talked with the operator. The guy inside the house yelled out, "He's alive, but in pretty bad shape. Tell them to get an ambulance here right away." Hearing he was alive, Becca leaped from the girl's arms, and she ran inside before anyone could stop her. She slid to the floor near Darren's head and whispered to him, "I'm so sorry. Please don't die. I love you." Her churning stomach was at odds with a desperate mind, trying to grasp the reality that the pitiful sight before her was the man she loved. His face was a mangled, bloody mess, swollen, discolored, and missing some teeth. One was on the floor just below his lips in a small pool of dried blood, connected by a coagulated stringer to the corner of his mouth. His left hip was badly swollen and obviously severely damaged. Moments later, the quiet little campus housing area was a beehive of sirens, police, and ambulance attendants. The police had Becca sit at the table as the EMTs started emergency treatment on Darren, prepping him for the trip to the hospital. While she sat watching the paramedics working on Darren, she felt utterly helpless. The thought kept running through her mind, who would want to hurt Darren? One of the police officers asked her, "Miss, do you have a driver's license or student ID?" Becca looked up in total confusion. The officer had to repeat the question 3 times before any comprehension was able to penetrate her shock. She nodded her head, slowly reaching into her pocket and pulled out her student ID. The policeman looked at the ID, then at Becca 3 or 4 times and remarked, "I'm sorry, but this picture doesn't look like you. Could I see your driver's license, please?" Becca seemed even more confused, then grabbed her hair as she mumbled, "Oh yeah, blonde not red." Looking at the officer, she listlessly replied, It's in my car parked in the driveway." The officer pointed towards the door. As soon as Becca was out of the house, the paramedics and the two officers lifted Darren onto the gurney. He moaned out loud, then fell silent. One of the EMTs whispered to the other, "I'd be screaming if you moved me with a busted femur and hip." The other man grimaced at the thought while nodding his understanding. By the time Becca got back, Darren was being rolled out to the ambulance. She handed her license to the policeman, then turned and followed the gurney to the ambulance. The driver tried to quickly explain to Becca as she begged to go with him that he couldn't allow her to ride in the ambulance because of insurance regulations. He finally gave up as he realized she wasn't hearing a word he was saying. The driver looked pleadingly at the police as they nodded and held on to Becca while she watched the back doors close and the ambulance pull away with its sirens blaring. In her whole life, Becca had never felt so broken. She was overwhelmed with terror for the man she loved. The police officer asked her to come back in and sit down. "Miss Anderton?" "Yes," Becca answered, without answering. "I can tell you are very upset and distraught, but I need you to tell us what happened, or at least what you know," the officer said in a firm but compassionate voice. After a tremendous effort, Becca was able to overcome her distress enough to tell him everything she knew from the previous day outside Darren's class till she called for help. It took all the effort she could muster to overcome her overwhelming desire to rush to the hospital to be at Darren's side. When she was finished, the officer asked, "Are you sure you didn't get a good look at the girl's face as she was leaving the apartment?" Becca was frustrated and began to cry as she shook her head. The policeman asked, "Do you have anyone who could come and pick you up?" Becca frowned. "Why do I need someone to come and get me? I have my own car," she responded tersely, not understanding the reason for the question. A soft feminine voice from behind her said, "Because, baby, you are in no condition to drive." Turning, Becca saw Tanya and her fiancé standing in the doorway. She jumped up, almost tripping over her chair as she rushed sobbing into her friend's embrace. Becca seemed to deflate as Darren's former girlfriend held her, running her hand over her hair, hushing and soothing her. The tall woman looked around the apartment. The condition of the room, trash from the paramedics, and obvious pools of blood told the horrific story. Tanya gripped Becca tighter as her own tears fell. She felt Becca trembling in her arms and said, "One of the runners who responded to your screams lives near me. I was outside talking to him when I realized it was Darren he was talking about, so we rushed right over." Looking at the officers, she asked, "Has anyone contacted his parents?" The policeman replied, "We haven't got that far yet. Do you know how to get in touch with his family?" A few moments later, with Becca's help, Tanya had Darren's personal phone book and called his parents. After she hung up, Tanya looked at Becca and said, "We were lucky his dad was home too. They will call us as soon as they confirm their reservations. Latif and I will pick them up at the airport." Tanya handed the policeman a piece of paper with all the pertinent data to get in touch with Darren's parents, as well as her own information in case they needed to talk to her. The police told them, "We need to close the house for now. Don't mean to be insensitive, but we must ask you to leave." Tanya nodded. Noticing the envelopes on the table addressed to Becca, she picked them up when the officer wasn't looking and stuffed them into her purse. She knew the officer wouldn't let her remove them until the investigation had been completed. Tanya knew Darren well enough to know that the envelopes had nothing to do with the crime, but in her opinion, it would be a crime for anyone other than Becca to read them. After reclaiming her IDs, Becca picked up her purse and headed out the door. Tanya and Latif walked Becca to their car to drive her to the hospital. Tanya knew she was dying to be with Darren. On the way, Tanya reached into her purse and handed Becca the envelopes. "What are these?" Becca asked with a face that expressed confusion while still in a state of semi-shock. "I imagine they will be self-explanatory," Tanya replied. Both ladies left it at that. By mid-afternoon, Becca, Tanya, and Latif were listening intently to one of the surgeons explain. "Darren is still in surgery and will be for a few more hours. He has a broken nose and 4 fractured teeth, as well as a broken femur head and an eggshell fracture of the hip near the left socket. In addition, he has sustained multiple cuts, lacerations, and contusions. The good news is the CAT scan showed no skull fractures or bleeding into the cranial area. The bad news is the hip and femur. He is going to live, but he will be in rough shape for a long time. Recovery will be a long process. I am sorry I don't have any more information, but I must get ready to scrub for another trauma case. The orthopedic and primary trauma surgeons will be down to talk to you as soon as they are finished." Becca just sat and stared ahead, rocking back and forth as Tanya held her. All the pretty blonde kept repeating was, "Why?" At 8:30 that night, Darren's parents, Paula and Thomas Courtier arrived. Paula walked over to Becca and said, "Thank you for saving our son's life. Tanya told us you were the one who found him and called the ambulance. If you hadn't stopped by when you did, he might have died." All Becca could do was nod. Then both women burst into tears, falling into each other's arms. It was almost 60 hours after his surgery before Darren came out of his medically induced fog. He was straining to see, but his eyes wouldn't open all the way. Hurting in an abstract way from head to toe, he attempted to shift a little to get slightly more comfortable, but the only result of his effort was a moan. Darren was confused as to why he couldn't move his left leg when he heard someone say, "He's awake. I'll get the nurse." Moments later, a female voice said, "Darren, I'm Kelly, your nurse. Can you hear me?" Wetting his lips and taking a deep breath, he tried to speak. Darren decided it was too much effort and managed a weak nod instead. He heard a chuckle. "Well, you're alive and kicking. Well, maybe not kicking. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Now here you go. Sip slowly. It's water." A straw was put to his lips. Darren sipped the water to wet his parched throat. After a few sips, Kelly continued, "Is your name Darren Courtier?" With great effort, he nodded again. "Any idea of what day it is?" Darren thought, then slowly shook his head gently. The nurse continued, "Okay, you're in the hospital. You were in some kind of fight and were pretty banged up. Besides a funny angle to your nose, you have several cuts, bruises, and 2 black eyes. For a while, your movements are going to be very limited because you also have a broken hip and thigh bone. It's Thursday, about 9 in the morning. Your mom and dad are here along with 2 very pretty young ladies named Tanya and Rebecca. They've been here almost constantly since you were first admitted. So take it easy on them if they are a little grouchy. I'll be back to talk to you in a few minutes and give you some more feel-good medicine. By the way, if either one of these young ladies belongs to you, then you're an extremely lucky young man." His mom and dad came up and talked to him, filling him in on most of what had happened and what little everyone knew. It made him feel good knowing they were there. After Tanya gave him some sweet concerned grief, Becca came over to the bed and took his hand. Darren whispered. So Becca moved up close to his face to hear him moan, "Thank you." She ran her thumb over the back of his hand as tears ran down her cheeks and replied, "For what?" His voice was weak and scratchy, but he was finally able to say, "You were with me. I heard you couldn't answer, but I heard you." Noticing how much effort it was taking for him to speak, Becca said, "Darren, we can talk later when you're stronger. I'll be here every free moment I have, so we will get to talk. Rest now, baby. Just rest and heal for all of us." Darren shook his head. No, then weakly rasped, "The biggest mistake we made." He moistened his dry lips before he continued, "Was not talking sooner. No more putting it off. We start talking now." Becca softly laughed as tears of pain rolled down her cheeks. It was heartrending and so romantically moving to watch his love for her struggle against all the pain he was suffering. "Whatever you want, when you want, I love you, Darren," was softly whispered in reply. He nodded as he struggled to whisper back, "I know, I heard you." The nurse returned with a cup of ice chips. Becca looked up with a pleading expression, her eyes darting repeatedly towards the cup. The nurse smiled knowingly and handed Becca the cup. "Darren, I just gave the young lady some ice chips. I'm going to see if she can coerce you into chewing on a few while I get the pain meds for you. If she's successful, I may let her have the job permanently, okay? Oh, and miss, make sure he only chews on the left side of his mouth. Otherwise, if the cold hits those fractured teeth, I guarantee you, he will come up out of that bed, cast and all, trust me." Becca gave Darren a few ice chips at a time. He chewed them dutifully until the nurse came back in. "Darren, I am going to put some medicine in your IV. It will help you relax and go to sleep. Okay, hon?" He managed a weak, "Yeah," as a slight warmth invaded his body just before his world faded to black. Becca had made sure she thoroughly understood everything the professors told her was important for Darren to pass his finals in order to graduate. She sat patiently waiting for him to review the material until he was ready for her to explain the rest. 4 weeks. Has it really been 4 weeks since the attack? Becca thought to herself. Now that the bruising and swelling have subsided, it's amazing how good he looks after all the damage and corrective surgery. Unfortunately, his hip and leg aren't doing too well. The senior doctor in orthopedics explained that the hip was going to take years to recover, if it recovered at all. There is severe nerve damage, and it doesn't have a great prognosis for healing. Darren didn't take that news well. He liked running and hiking, but at least for the time being those activities are going to be off limits to him. Becca looked up at Darren, his nose still in his study material. Her thoughts returned to their relationship or non-relationship. I still need to talk to him about the assault and the night of the attack. But every time I have tried to bring it up, he says, not now. After his finals tomorrow, we are going to talk. I know we both feel the underlying tension and need to get this out in the open. Her own frustration with the police investigation's inability to identify an attacker was wearing on her patience. She knew it must be driving Darren wacky. He's sticking to his story that he didn't know the girl's name he had been with the night of the attack. If that's true, I can't figure out why she was with him or why they kissed each other. You don't kiss a girl you don't know. The two police officers seemed kind of befuddled too. In spite of the mystery woman's reason for being with Darren that night, Becca did have the comfort of the letters he had written to her. Recalling what she had read caused her to stop and ponder. After reading Darren's letters, his actions that night don't make any sense. His letters plainly state he loves me and wants to work this mess out. I know he's telling everyone he really can't remember a lot from the time I saw him outside his classroom till he woke up. But by his own admission, he is getting little disjointed memory flashes. The only thing that seems to be sticking in his memory is my signal with the water bottle, whatever the hell that means. Also, he thinks the girl's name was funny sounding, maybe a nickname. I can tell he is confused over the whole thing too. One big help for Becca was her dad, Phil Anderton, who had been down to see her 3 times since that night. Her dad wasn't an imposing man physically, but had a heart of gold. This was the 3rd time he came to see her. He simply asked her as they sat in Gwen's apartment, "Okay, you have a lot on your plate with all Darren's been through, but I want to know what it is that has been bothering you ever since you came home for spring break." Becca felt like a dam burst inside her as she told her dad about the drugging and assault Hayden Olsen had perpetrated. She could tell her dad was angry. The veins in his forehead were sticking out and his ears were bright red. "Why didn't you go to the hospital and to the police?" he asked with gentleness, even though there was steel behind his voice. She responded, but very meekly, as if the memories of that wound were still too fresh to bear. "Dad, I didn't have any proof except the situation I woke up to." "Well, that and Hayden's conceited knowing smile whenever I've run into him since. Plus I was confused, hurt, and not thinking, but it would have made no difference. He evidently used a protection, and without a witness, even if my blood had shown drugs, how was I going to prove who gave them to me? There was a ton of kids at the club that night. It could have been any of them, although I know better." "I'm sorry, Daddy." Phil took his baby girl into his arms as she sobbed gently on his shoulder. "It's okay, baby. The important thing is to get both of you past this and on with your lives." Now he understood the meaning of powerless. He wanted to help his daughter so bad, but could provide little more than comfort. Darren's parents must be experiencing the same thing. At that moment, Phil had never felt so helpless, and he was not the type of man who liked or would even accept that feeling. Sometime later that evening, after Becca and her dad had time to deal with their emotions, her dad asked, "Does Darren know?" Becca sighed, "No. That was one of the things I was going to discuss with him that night." While looking at his daughter, Phil replied, "Please be careful when you tell him. From what Paula and Tom have told me, the doctors are trying not to add to Darren's stress level right now." Becca acknowledged what her dad said with a nod while thinking, "Yes, he's stressed, but I've got to talk to him. I have to tell him what happened and try to find out what occurred that evening just before the attack." When she arrived at the hospital the following afternoon, Becca ran into Mitchell and Larrabee, the 2 police detectives who had been working on Darren's case. They were coming out of Darren's room as she approached. "Ah, Miss Anderton, I'm glad we caught you," Detective Larrabee said. "We have been able to verify your statements of the events you witnessed the night of the attack. In addition, a witness, who saw 3 or 4 individuals exit Darren's house between 9:30 and 10 on the night of the attack, has come forward." Becca excitedly asked, "Do you know who the individuals are?" The 2 detectives glanced at each other, then turned and headed towards the elevators. As they walked away, Detective Mitchell said over his shoulder, "Have a good day, miss." The thought crossed Becca's frustrated mind. That was strange, but then again, so are they, as she watched them leave. One being tall and chubby, the other short and thin, makes them look more like a comedy team instead of policemen. Becca walked into Darren's room and saw him looking at her intently. She smiled, "Hi, how are you doing today?" The scowl on his face never changed, but he replied, "Actually decent, now that finals are over. Before I forget, thank you so much for working with my professors to get me caught up and through my courses." Becca came up next to him and kissed his cheek. "It was my pleasure." He waited for her to get settled, then said, "I don't know how to say this any other way, Becca. That night in the Commons, why were you trying to embarrass me? If you had just said, 'Go away,' I would have. It would have hurt, but I would have left you alone. Why did you want to do that to me?" The pain and frustration in his voice obvious. As he tried to keep his voice under control, it was already higher pitched than normal. Becca sat dumbfounded. shaking her head. What are you talking about? I was waiting for you in the Commons. Doing her utmost not to shout, her knuckles turned white as they tightly gripped the arms of her chair. She loudly and forcefully proclaimed, all I wanted was to get back with you. Oh sure, now you can make believe it never happened. I was there, Becca. I saw and heard it all. Your new boyfriend, the water bottle signal that brought him running, everything. A spasm crossed his face as he clenched his jaw. Please explain, because I haven't had a boyfriend other than you since I came to this school. Becca's voice was strained as she continued sharply. You can talk to Gwen or Tanya. Hell, you can talk to Elizabeth or Gabby from work. They are always asking me why I don't date. Becca stopped in mid-sentence as she suddenly realized Darren's eyes indicated he wasn't listening to her anymore. In the middle of her response to his weird tirade, his face suddenly showed a dawning realization to something she said. Looking at Becca, Darren swallowed hard before he requested, say it again, please. Still reeling from the unexpected attack, Becca fixed her eyes on Darren with a level stare. Say what again, please? Her voice tinged with agitation. Darren was shaking when he repeated, say that girl's name again. The last one? Becca looked at Darren. He was acting strangely. She replied questioningly, Elizabeth? With his eyes haunted by some inner anxiety, Darren licked his lips. No, the last one. G.A. The word seemed to be caught in his throat. As Becca stared at Darren, she watched the color drain from his face when she questioned, Gabby? Darren just nodded as he sat staring out the window. He began to sweat as he whispered, Gabby, that's the name of the girl who was with me that night. I went to the Commons to see you and saw your games. He swallowed hard as he tried to continue. Becca was going to ask him to explain but decided against it, listening intently as he continued. I was hurt because of what I heard them say in the Commons, so I went back to my car. A girl named Gabby came up asking me if I had an outline for the art class we were in. After I took her to the house, I got sick remembering what I saw you do. Then I copied the outline for her and offered to take her home. She refused and kissed me at the door. Still reeling from the events at the Commons, I went back in to sit down. I don't know how long I had been sitting there when the doorbell rang. Thinking it was Gabby and she'd probably changed her mind about the ride, I opened the door and Darren flinched and his hand moved up in front of his face as if to block an unseen blow. Someone hit you in the face, Becca answered. Darren nodded but said nothing. Becca came over to the bed and sat down. Darren, can you remember anything else? Darren squinted. His facial muscles twitched nervously as he nodded. A voice saying his property. Then your voice talking to me. It seemed much later. You said you loved me. He felt her hand on his chin as she tenderly moved his head to look him in the eyes. As her face came into focus, he could see a small rivulet of tears on both cheeks. As he looked at her mouth, she said, I have no idea what you heard or what you thought you saw me do. But yes, Darren, I meant what I said. I love you. He smiled. I love you too. Emotionally drained, he laid his head back onto his pillow, closed his eyes, and drifted off to sleep. As she sat holding his hand, Becca said to herself, we need to have just a little more discussion in order for me to figure out what Darren thought happened that night in the Commons. After mentally going over everything Darren had said, she thought, but I know one thing. As soon as Paula gets here, I'm going to go find a certain little girl named Gabby. We're going to have our own heart-to-heart talk, whether she's willing or not. Retrieving her cell phone, Becca moved off the bed, dialing as she went. After a few rings, Tanya answered out of breath. Yeah, girl, talk to me. Bad timing, huh? Becca teased. With a bit of irritation in her voice, Tanya replied, it will be if I can't get back to it soon. Okay, I need to see you and Latif as soon as possible. I think I know the name of the girl I saw at Darren's that night. We need to talk to her before the police. Her voice became higher pitched as the excitement of her discovery began to build. Excitedly, Tanya asked, do I know her? No sooner had she inquired than Becca recognized that protective tone in her voice and realized she better not give Gabby's name to Tanya. Otherwise, there might not be anything left for Becca or the police to interrogate. You've seen her around. We can talk more when you get here. Becca had a strong premonition that the name Gabby and the phrase his property were closely related. The whole convoluted scene in the Commons that night, the unexpected confrontation with Hayden, lots of things seemed to be falling into place. Positive she knew how, now she needed to find out why. She was pretty sure she knew the answer to that also. God, if I'm right, what am I going to do? She whispered out loud. The bile in her stomach churned at the mere thought of her assaulter being involved. Confused and angry, she had to find Gabby to see if her hunch was correct. Later that afternoon, Becca was standing outside Gabby's dorm room and knocked softly. Moments later, the door opened and Gabby stood blinking at Becca, a tall girl, and a really cute big guy standing in her doorway. With her lower lip quivering, Gabby half begged and half pleaded in a scared and tension-laden voice. "What do you want?" Becca said, "I think we need to talk, Gabby." Latif punctuated Becca's comment by grabbing the door and pushing it open. With fear in her eyes, Gabby retreated into her room away from the door. As all three visitors entered her room, they didn't have to say a word. Gabby knew why they were there. Her head bowed as she looked at the floor. She seemed defeated. It was plain to see she was about to dissolve into tears at any moment. There was a hitch in her voice as she raised her head to look at Becca. "I didn't know Becca. If I had, I would never have given him the address. I would never have gone with Darren that night." Becca watched as the pretty young woman's body shook as she began to cry. They could see that she was guilt-ridden and eager to confess. Tanya took the girl in her arms to comfort her. Becca allowed herself a slight smile. Tanya had been holding on to a lot of emotionally distraught females lately. "You have to believe me, I didn't know. I wouldn't have told him if I had known Darren would get hurt. I got really mad when I heard about the assault a couple of days later. He denied it until I said I was going to the police. He blew his top cussing at me, calling me all sorts of names, and telling me what happens to people who betray him or mess with his property. I haven't seen him since. Yesterday I put in for a transfer to a college near my hometown for my senior year. I'm afraid to be anywhere near him." Becca, who had been nodding her head as Gabby spoke, softly asked in a quivering voice, "Who is the guy who threatened you, Gabby?" "Hayden. Hayden Olsen." Gabby fearfully muttered. "Gabby, you have to go to the police with this. They need to know," Becca said sternly. I can't," Gabby pleaded. "He'll kill me." "The reason you have to, Gabby, is because if you don't, he may kill you anyway," Becca cajoled. "Your only guarantee of safety is to put him away where he can't hurt anyone." Gabby sobbed, "Please, just don't leave me to face this by myself. I don't think I can do it alone." Becca witnessed the fear in Gabby explode as her body shook. Her breathing quickened as she peered about wild-eyed, as if expecting Hayden to suddenly appear from some darkened corner. Gabby's reaction had Becca scared. She had the sudden sensation in the pit of her stomach of falling through an unexpected trapdoor. Her own fear of another possible confrontation with Hayden was making her heart pound and the blood roar in her ears. Latif interrupted Becca's thoughts when he said, "Come on, we need to get Gabby to the police station." Becca and Tanya both looked at Gabby, who was slowly letting out a deep breath to calm herself. Then nodding her head, she grabbed her purse and replied, "Let's do it now before I lose my nerve." They were surprised at how long the detectives questioned Gabby. By the time she was released, Tanya had talked Latif into letting Gabby move into their spare bedroom for the remainder of the spring term. Gabby was obviously relieved to be living off campus with people she knew and trusted until school let out. The following day, the detectives came to talk to Darren and ask him how he came to remember Miss Gabrielle Redding was the girl in his apartment that night. Darren explained he and Becca were in a heated conversation and her name was mentioned. That's all it took. The detectives read him about a dozen names, both male and female, including Hayden Olsen as well as the two other suspects, Mike Sheridan and Les Rafferton. Darren knew Hayden, but none of the other names on the list rang any bells. A few days later, the detectives returned to inform Darren and Becca that they did have more promising leads and a few people of interest, but nothing of any significance. They quietly confided to Becca the three young men Miss Redding had informed them about had been rounded up for questioning. After a lengthy interrogation, all their stories were and remained the same. There was no way to prove their guilt at this time. The detectives did warn Becca to be careful. Becca fearfully questioned, "Why?" The detectives just shook their heads. One replied, "You can just never be too careful." Realizing it was a warning, a heartfelt one at that, Becca knew the detectives wouldn't and couldn't mention names because of potential liability. Becca's heart seemed to stop as she immediately realized with the three brutal a-holes still running loose, Gabby's life could be in danger. She could only hope and pray that Hayden would realize the stupidity of messing with a potential witness since he would be the primary suspect. What scared her most is how stupid Hayden appeared to really be. Just before the end of the term, Gabby stopped by to apologize to Darren. During her visit, she shared her constant fear that Hayden would try to retaliate for her confession to the police. "What confession?" Darren asked with confusion. Though surprised by the question, Gabby proceeded to inform Darren of the entire event and everything that took place. Becca could see the anger erupting not only on Darren's face, but also in his eyes. After Gabby left, he glared at Becca and his parents, demanding with obvious anger in his voice, "Why didn't any of you tell me about Gabby's disclosure?" Being denied her confession, which would have put a face to the terror that had been haunting his nightmares for weeks, caused his blood to boil. Besides his voice, Becca could tell from his flaring nostrils he was beyond angry. Before she could answer, his dad interceded. "Son, the police wanted you to have as little input as possible to see if you could remember details that would validate her story. Any info we fed you would weaken any correlating information." Becca watched Darren's eyes. The last thing she needed was for him to feel she was hiding something from him. Darren saw her body tense as a look of fear crossed her face. Darren put up his hand to stop Becca from speaking. He looked out the window as he composed himself, then drew a deep breath before turning towards Becca and declaring, "It's okay. I understand." All she could mumble was "thank you," as Darren nodded. Sadly, she realized he was suffering from a lot more pain than just the physical beating he had suffered. If there had been any possible way, she would have absorbed it all to give him some relief. She thought back over the frustrating conversations they had endured up to the point he recognized Gabby's name. It had taken days, a lot of tears, and a heavy toll on Becca and Darren before they had been able to finally agree on the chain of events that had occurred the night of the attack. Now they both finally realized they had been set up, and their anger towards one another was totally misdirected. Even though the animosity had been buried under a lot of other issues, neither of them had completely believed the other's story at first. Hayden had done his homework well. With the air cleared, so to speak, Darren still had an unanswered question or two he couldn't bring himself to ask her about. Most importantly, how did the son of a witch know about the birthmark? Maybe I'm still afraid of the answer, he thought. Darren's mother had talked to Becca the night before. Paula had been worried about the tension between the two kids. "Becca, I don't believe you are fully recovered from the whole jumbled mess. I know Darren isn't. The two of you have to get past this weird guarded dance routine you are doing around each other. Please, we can see the love you two have for one another. But for a relationship, this is going to be a hard road to hoe until one of you opens up. Just think about it, hon." Becca could do nothing more than nod as Paula embraced her before letting her return to sit with Darren. The following morning when Becca arrived, Darren was watching her intently. After she settled in, Darren's face showed his confusion as he addressed her. "Becca, thanks for putting up with my anger last night after Gabby's revelation slipped out. I really do understand why all of you were silent on that." Becca felt a tightness in her chest. She had come over this morning with the purpose of telling him about the assault, but it was apparent Darren had some issues he wanted to talk about. Steeling herself, she nodded and whispered, "Thanks." Darren was concentrating very hard when he took a long, slow breath, looked at Becca, and asked, "The afternoon of the attack, you asked me to meet you in the Commons, neutral ground you called it. You also said you had something else to talk about if everything went well. What was it you were going to tell me?" The color seemed to drain from Becca's face as she slowly got up to come over and sit on his bed. He noticed her eyes took on a haunted look just before she turned her head to stare out the window. Darren asked, "Becca, are you okay? You don't look well." When she turned back towards him, he could plainly see the tears rolling just before she buried her face in his chest and began to sob. All Darren could do was hold her and stroke the back of her head tenderly to help her calm down, while he waited for answers to alleviate his apprehension. After a few minutes, she had calmed herself sufficiently to gather her courage to speak. Her voice was barely a whisper as she said, "Darren, he assaulted me." Darren looked at Becca, his eyes, which were almost as big as saucers, betraying his mind's refusal to believe what he had just heard. What did you just say?" He stammered out in reply. "He assaulted me, Darren. He put something in my drink at the club, took me to his apartment, and assaulted me." She cast her eyes at the floor in humiliation. It was obvious what she was telling him was causing her tremendous pain. With her heart in her throat, she looked up at Darren, praying for understanding. Darren gently pulled her to him, asking, "Who, Becca? Who assaulted you?" His voice was as quiet and tender as he could make it, but he knew in his heart before Becca said another word, Hayden Olsen was also the perpetrator of her attack. She managed to choke out, Hayden Olsen drugged and assaulted me the weekend before spring break started." Darren held her tightly against him, as if by sheer force of will, he could push away the demons in her tiny, quivering body. He felt so relieved. Now he finally had the final piece of the puzzle. That's how Hayden had known about the heart-shaped birthmark. If she had only told him sooner, all the doubts, all the nightmares, all the wondering would have been alleviated. She had been telling him the truth when she said, "I haven't had a boyfriend other than you since I came to this school." Darren angrily thought, "Good thing for Hayden, I'm confined to this bed. Otherwise, I would make it a personal vendetta to rid the world of that son of a witch, and would do it with extreme prejudice." Becca, why didn't you tell me before? Why didn't you tell me as soon as you were? The day it happened? He stumbled over his words as he tried to work things out in his head. In between sobs, Becca managed to mumble, I tried. I went to your house first, but you weren't home. No one was home, so I went to Gwen's place. She told me she tried to call you a few times over that weekend, but got no answer. Darren suddenly and very forcefully shouted, Shit, of course I wasn't there. I was already home on spring break. I was excused from midterms. Oh, Becca, I'm so sorry. She continued to cry, lying across his chest. Nothing more was said for what seemed like hours, until Darren heard the soft rhythmic sound of Becca's snoring. He pulled her into bed as he painfully slid to the side. While holding her, his mind was going a million miles an hour. She has been suffering every bit as much as me, but she's still focused on my pain. This whole thing's been one big disjointed interaction. He lay there just thinking, looking up at the ceiling for a long time before finally drifting off to sleep himself. Gabby left campus right after school was out since Gwen had returned home for the summer. After being invited, Becca decided to stay with Latif and Tanya. The third week of June, she was finally allowed to go into Darren's apartment. Tanya, Latif, and two of his friends helped Becca clean up the mess. They started by throwing out anything that was blood-splattered, then scrubbed, sealed, and repainted the walls and ceiling. Working their way down, they saved the stripping and resealing of the floor until last. It took 5 days, but the apartment looked and smelled as good as new. After packing up Darren's stuff, they put it in storage for him. The first week of July was a big milestone for Darren. For the first time, he was brought to physical therapy, or PT as the nurse called it. By the time he returned to his room, he was in pain and very cranky. Becca came in with a smile on her face. Hey baby, how did it go today? She asked as she put down her purse and laptop before moving over to his bed. Darren just glared at her. His silence told her all she wanted to know. She tried a different attack. Anyway, you need to congratulate me. I finished all my finals and passed all 3 of my courses. It was obvious she was proud of herself and was looking for tribute. Darren mumbled, Congratula. Wait a minute. For which courses? The first half of summer classes aren't even over yet. Becca flushed a bit. No, these are grades for some of my spring semester courses. When you were hurt, I asked for an incomplete in 3 of my classes. So I had the first 6 weeks of summer term to finish up. She shrugged her shoulders, flashing a nervous smile at Darren. Darren reached over and hit the call button for the nurse. Moments later, one popped her head in. What you need, sweetie? Some pain meds? Please, came his quiet reply. The nurse headed out and Darren looked at Becca, who was still standing a few feet from the bed. He held out his hand and she came to him. Looking at her with a sentimental mist forming in his eyes in spite of his pain, he asked, You did that for me? You were willing to do that after what I thought? Or you thought you still did that after the way I treated you? Before Becca could reply, the nurse walked in with his pain pills. After she poured him a cup of water, he grimaced as he took them. Everything seemed painful to him, even swallowing pills. After the nurse left, Becca kissed his face and gently replied in a loving voice, Yes, even though you haven't always been very nice, I still love you. She realized the openness this situation afforded them as they began to just talk like they used to about all sorts of things. The following morning, the detectives, Mitchell and Larrabee, came to see Darren. Between the smiles on their faces and the bounce in their steps, Paula and Becca knew they had some good news. Both of the officers smiled brightly as they sat down to talk to Darren. His family and friends gathered in close, sensing something important had finally happened in the case. Coming straight to the point, Detective Larrabee informed, Folks, one of the young men Miss Redding identified as being with Mr. Olson the night of the attack, one Les Rafferton, called the police station 2 evenings ago and confessed to the crime. He obviously had a bad case of a guilty conscience bothering him. Anyway, he confirmed everything about that night, filling in all of our missing timeline. He not only told us everything Mr. Olson planned and set up, but how he went about pulling it off. He even pointed out where we could find some extremely damning physical evidence. By the time Rafferton got to the station, he was trying to recant his statement. Claims some big guy pressed a gun to his head, forcing him to make the call. We think it's just a cover story to try and protect his, but for snitching out his cohorts, Mike Sheridan and Hayden Olson. Darren, my boy, if the DNA comes back showing what we think it will, we have the evidence to put the 3 of them away. We should have them up on charges in a few days. Things will run quickly after that. So relax now, we got him. Becca and Paula were crying as they hugged the officers, Darren, and each other. The formal arrests were made. Both Les Rafferton and Mike Sheridan turned state's evidence in exchange for consideration at sentencing. It was months before the legal wrangling was finished, but Rafferty and Sheridan were both sentenced to 3 years in prison with follow-up probation. Hayden Olsen's legal team presented a motion to the judge to dismiss the case based on insanity at the time of the attack. After 3 separate psychological exams, the judge denied the motion. The jury found Hayden Olsen guilty, and the judge sentenced him to 15 years in prison plus 25 years on probation to be served after his incarceration was complete. The judge made it clear at sentencing that Mr. Olsen had acted in a manner that would be considered consistent only with a person who was in full control of his facilities. In planning, carrying out, and threatening people before, during, and after the attack on Mr. Courtier. It turned out to be a long and miserable summer as Becca and Darren spent more time bickering or arguing than talking and communicating. The doctors and nurses told Becca this kind of anger, denial, and depression was normal for people in Darren's condition, but it didn't deflect the pain his increasingly angry barbs forced her to absorb. In August, Darren was informed he was being transferred to a facility near his home to complete a year of intense physical therapy. After he received the news, they had a huge confrontation. Darren was insisting Becca finish her degree before coming to join him. Becca wanted to take a year off to go be with and help him. He was being a complete shit, yelling and screaming. "This is a time when I need to apply my full concentration to my therapy. Even though I love you, you would be a big distraction, interfering with my healing." With that tirade, Becca was very concerned Darren was becoming overly withdrawn and spiteful. His angry outbursts were now a daily occurrence. A week before he was to be transferred, Becca tried one more time to talk some sense into him. "Darren, this isn't right. I've talked to both our parents and all our friends. They all agree. After the last few months, it would be best for me to go with you at least until Christmas. I can help you, and we can be together while." "Becca," Darren shouted in exasperation. "I have to find a way to work things out for myself without anyone's help. Damn it, I need to feel like a man, able to take care of myself. Can't you see without that I will never fully recover? Now drop it, just drop it. I want us to be together, but not until you have completed your education and I get through this ordeal. Damn it, why can't I get through to you?" Storming out of the room, Becca headed straight to Tanya's apartment. After slamming the door to her room, she threw herself on the bed, crying herself to sleep. The absolute mean-spirited anger that Becca had come to fear and almost despise in him was so out of character it was frightening. She had done her best to be loving and understanding, only to have it repeatedly thrown back in her face. It had finally become too much to bear. A week later, as Darren was saying his goodbyes before departing by ambulance to board a medical transport, he and Becca talked for the last time before his flight home. Becca looked him in the eyes, cupped his face, and said, "I love you, Darren, and I want to be with you, but I will respect your wishes and let you go it alone." Then she kissed him deeply. Darren, who seemed stiff and a bit edgy, kissed her back, then replied, "Thank you for finally realizing that I need to do this by myself. I need to prove that I can cut it. When I come back for your graduation in May, we'll discuss our future then." With big tears in her eyes, Becca looked him squarely in the eyes. "That's bullshit, and you know it. You are going to run and hide in your own little world, in your own little space. You're hurting, and your only way of coping is by running away. You won't be back. You'll just find another excuse to stay away. All you're trying to do is hide, even from me. But know this, Darren Courtier, after my graduation, I will make sure we complete what we've started. If nothing else, always remember that I will always love you. There's no place for you to hide. I am letting you go, knowing you will become the man I know you to be. Believe me, I love you so much. I want a future with us together. So when you finally figure out we need each other, I'll be here," she retorted. Her strong, powerful tone took Darren aback. He couldn't think of a thing to say. Kissing him again, she turned on her heels and left him sitting behind the ambulance. He waited a moment, then indicated he was ready to be loaded. Afterwards, he lay inside the ambulance, blankly staring at the ceiling, wondering, "I don't understand how she could know I wasn't planning to come back. We both need to get on with life. She needs someone who is whole and complete, not a cripple like me." The ambulance pulled out, headed towards the airport. If Darren had glanced out the window, he would have seen Tanya holding a grief-stricken Becca, her body shaking, racked by her own gut-wrenching sobs. Darren was probably lucky he didn't see the tall woman straining to comfort Becca. While staring intently at the departing ambulance, she angrily mouthed the word, "a-hole." While lying on the low table in physical therapy, Darren waited to see who they would assign to him next. Over the past 8 months, his hostile and abusive outbursts had earned him 4 different therapists. Last Friday, the 4th one refused to work with him anymore. Now Maureen Sanderson, head of the PT department, was walking towards him with a clipboard in her arms. Mrs. Sanderson reminded Darren of a nice-looking mid-30s soccer mom type. Dark short cropped hair, smallish glasses with dark tinted lenses which framed and dominated her face. He had been going to therapy at this clinic for almost a year and had only seen Maureen without her glasses 4 or 5 times. Her left eye was prosthetic. That defect gave Darren an affinity towards her. Darren was slowly lifting his left leg a few inches as he did his warm-up exercises. Mrs. Sanderson stood next to him for a few minutes and said, "Lift the leg higher. You are never going to get rehabilitated at this rate." Lifting his leg a few more inches, he gritted between pain-clenched teeth. "What's the use? I'm going to be like this forever." The woman looked down at him with a scowl. You refuse to do the exercises, verbally abused the staff. Terry is the 4th therapist you've driven off. Now you expect us to provide another victim for your pity party? She switched to a pout. "Poor me. My life is ruined." Then she started singing, "Nobody knows the troubles I've seen." Darren recognized the old spiritual, but didn't appreciate her personal sarcastic rendition delivered with a nasty attitudinal slur. He didn't immediately respond to her, but the undisguised hate in his eyes spoke volumes. Suddenly, without warning, he ferociously exploded, spitting out his pain. "How dare you mock me? Nobody understands. I had a life, a girl I was going to marry. My life was just beginning. One stupid violent act and everything was gone. All because my girlfriend wanted to party, and with another guy." His face flushed as his emotional dam collapsed, voice dripping with sarcasm. He continued, "Oh, believe me, I know you have your own crisis. Your nail broke, bad hair day, car broke down, flat tire, an electrical bill bigger than normal so you won't be able to buy that other shade of lipstick? Then if I don't lift my leg 2 more inches, I'm the bad guy. Bullshit, which, try walking in some shoes filled with real-life pains. My leg and hip hurt. Okay," he hissed. With his anger vented, he despondently continued, "It's painful. I have spasms all night, but there isn't anyone to help. I don't even want to try anymore." Flopping back on the table, in one sweeping motion, he threw his towel against the wall just before his arm dropped to cover his eyes. Maureen stood passively waiting for him to finish, then replied, "Are you through with your tantrum?" Looking up at Maureen, he saw the mother look. Darren's jaw stubbornly locked in place seconds before finally deflating. "Yes," he replied dejectedly, thinking to himself, "I hate when I do that, unloading on just anyone. I don't like what I am becoming." Maureen sat down next to him and lifted up his leg to where it should have been and held it. Darren thought she was mumbling to herself until she looked him in the eyes and continued. Her voice was so low he had to strain to hear her say, "You have no idea how happy I am to be able to lift and hold your leg up like this. There was a time I was so lost and confused. I was sure God hated me, and I didn't know what I had done wrong. I was 16 years old walking home from softball practice. At the end of our street, there was a vacant lot we used as a shortcut. There is where he made his move and grabbed me. I must have screamed." Her voice thick with emotion, she began telling her story to Darren. "After slamming me to the ground, he crammed a piece of cloth in my mouth and threatened me to lie still. He slapped me hard 4 or 5 times to make sure I got the point. The one thing that made me freeze and haunted me for years was the stone-cold emptiness of his eyes as they erratically jumped around. I have never before or since felt the gut-sick terror of fear like I did for those few minutes. He didn't assault me, but instead laughed at me, telling me he had to rid the world of young 304s like me, that I made him do this because of the way I was dressed. I remember thinking, I'm in sweats, how frumpier could I look? Then I saw him raise his hand just before he hit me in the side of the head. God, it hurt. I know he hit me at least twice before I passed out. I found out later he used some kind of pipe and hit me 3 times on the side of the head and face. My 12-year-old brother and 3 of his friends had heard me scream and came running. When they saw the guy hit me, all 4 of them began shouting and swinging their baseball bats. They hit the guy in the head so hard he staggered off me. The kids continued their attack, smacking his knees, ankles, and arms until he limped out the back of the lot and into the alley. They never did find the a-hole. Thankfully, my brother yanked the cloth from my mouth when he noticed I was turning blue. My nose was broken and had immediately swollen to the point I couldn't breathe. I've had to live with the damage from just a few swings of that pipe. She took Darren's hand and with determination traced a scar hidden behind her hairline. Beneath that scar lies a steel plate. Beneath the steel plate lies an injury that cost me the full use of my right leg and arm. Try walking without the use of your right leg. Try a lot of things without the full use of your right arm. Along with the broken nose came a shattered eye. Try seeing normally with only one eye. Another casualty was my natural sense of safety. Try sleeping at night when your dreams are nothing but nightmares. Another side effect of the head injury is seizures. Try getting a driver's license with active seizures. To this day, I take medication to prevent them. Yet here I am 18 years later, doing everything I can to help others. I have recovered the use of my leg and arm and have my seizures under control. I am married and have 2 wonderful kids. My husband has been with me every step of the way since the first day we met. I can't begin to explain how happy I am to have him. I don't deserve him. Your attitude is a carbon copy of mine when I began my therapy. Thank God I met my husband shortly after starting. I didn't think anyone would ever love or want me again. He was a big help, not only supporting me and giving me new hope, but becoming the reason for me to succeed. It took me 3 years to get out of treatment. I made a vow to myself that I would go to college and become a physical therapist so that I could help others. Too bad that girlfriend of yours didn't work out. She could have been a big motivation for you to succeed. Smiling over at him, she continued, my own physical therapist had a history too. Only, the pain that he endured recovering from a combination of burns and injuries was beyond anything I had experienced. He just told me, Maureen, sometimes life deals you a hand of cards that suck, but you have to play them, because it's the only hand you get. Looking at Darren, she said, like it or not, this is the hand you were dealt. It is my job to help you learn to play the cards you've got. Pausing for a moment to get her emotions in check, she looked at Darren. I think I can sympathize with how you feel. Now are you ready to lift that leg? Darren nodded and with newfound respect said, I'm sorry. Maureen returned a sad smile and calmly replied, so am I, for all of us, but, groaning with tremendous pain, Darren pushed his leg up and for the first time truly began to exercise. When he was through, Maureen came over and asked him, how do you feel? Offering her hand and helping him up before handing him his cane as they walked towards the door. Like I was just run over by a semi, but I'll be here tomorrow for more of the same. I apologized to Terry. She said if I showed up tomorrow ready to go to work, she would be here. Nodding, her eyes refusing to meet his, Maureen inquired, Darren, can I ask you something? The look on her face and sound of her voice reeked of the one thing men feared more than war, emotional inquest incoming. Not sure he was ready to deal with any more emotional issues, but not knowing for sure what she was going to ask, he politely murmured, sure. A sad expression enveloped her face as she asked him, you said something when you were exploding during your tirade earlier. Do you really believe your girlfriend purposefully wanted the problems this guy caused you? Darren watched Maureen as she stared at him with a deep sadness in her eyes. She seemed to be looking right through him into his soul. It was annoying and unnerving. Closing his eyes, he leaned against the wall for support, and for the first time in months, delved into the deep recesses of his own thoughts and feelings. The answer was there. He had just been avoiding the question until now. If Becca had even an inkling of what Hayden had been capable of doing, would she have gone near him? No, not my little fireball, the one gal who had totally won my heart and mind, the one I fell for. He found himself smiling as an interlude of her memories flooded his heart. All she wanted was to help me get better so we could be together, while I wallowed in self-pity. No, she would rather die than see anyone hurt by her actions. He shook his head. A lone tear trailed down the side of his face as he pulled himself out of the swirling pool of memories and whispered, no, Maureen, she wouldn't have allowed that to happen. It was only more of my displaced anger. Nodding, she looked for a moment, as though she was going to pass on saying anything more. Finally shaking her head, she replied, I hope you can patch it up with her. You may not know it, but you glow a bit when you talk about her, the kind of glow you could use more of. As she headed out the door to call the next patient, Darren followed, replying, thanks, I hope so too. When he got home that afternoon, Darren plugged in his computer for the first time in months. Becca was probably not going to answer him, but he would apologize. He thought of her last words to him at the hospital parking lot before he came home. Those words were like ice picks in his soul. He was now so very ashamed of himself. As he began to type, he felt the hot tears roll down his face. Each one removed a small part of the anger and self-pity that had been poisoning his soul. As the anger lifted, it revealed the depth of his feelings for Becca lying just beneath the surface. He poured his soul into the email, begging her to forgive him and pleading for her to come see him, or at least tell him where he could come to her. After almost an hour of typing, he hit the send button and prayed. As Becca sat in Gwen's living room, she was unusually quiet considering it was the weekend. With graduation just a few weeks away, Becca was beginning to get more than a little angry and frustrated at the whole situation. Taking into account what had occurred over the past few months, she tried to figure out her next move. Since Darren left, I've tried everything I could think of to keep his mind on us. I used to call him twice a week on top of emailing as often as I could. Even sent him those little love notes by snail mail. Did he show me any consideration? Not no, but hell no. Didn't respond to my calls and only answered about 1 in 4 of my emails. But he didn't get angry or abusive with me. I just hated those mixed signals he was sending. I could tell by Darren's emails that he was slipping into some sort of depression. After 3 or 4 months and no calls, I know I'm the one who gave up, but now I'm wondering if I gave up too easily. Everything seemed to work against us this year. My old email account even got hacked and I had to close it. Damn it. Why do I keep doing this to myself? He has my new email address. I sent it to him. If he really wanted to get in touch with me, I'm here. It's apparent he doesn't want to see me, but I refuse to give up on us. His mom always said I'm welcome there anytime. That's my last resort. If he doesn't show for my graduation, then we're going to have a showdown. But damn it, it will have to wait. Daddy has asked me to come home and help Mom. She had to put off her surgical procedure until after my graduation since I'm the only one who can lend a hand full-time. Soon as my mom's back on her feet, he'd better get ready. I'll drag his butt out by his ear if I have to and force him to deal with us. My love will not be denied, and I will not be denied my love. Breaking out of her little world and looking out the window at the sky, Becca suddenly said in a voice tinged with irritation, "You know, God, with just a little more effort, you could have made this whole thing just a tad easier for the both of us. By the way, it's not too late, you know?" Gwen's laughter from behind her startled Becca, and she jumped while turning around. Gwen said, "Girlfriend, you sure know how to pick fights with the big boys, don't you? I tend to be more pleading and less demanding when it comes to the big guy. But you go, girl. Just sleep in a tent tonight, so my apartment doesn't get hit by lightning." Both girls laughed, and then Gwen asked, "What movie do you want to see?" "I already said we are going to TGI Fridays for dinner and drinks afterwards. Latif and Tanya will meet us there." As Becca stood with her hands on her hips, she snorted. "In that case, we are going to see a movie with at least 2 good-looking male stars. One for you and one for me. That way we won't have to fight over who gets to fantasize about the hero." Gwen squealed, "Great, a man for each of us. You can have the oldest one. I like mine young and virile." Cocking her eyebrow, Becca jokingly inquired, "Young, huh? Just how young?" Gwen responded in mock seriousness, "Pretty young, but at least old enough to be legal." Grabbing their purses as they shared a chorus of laughter, the two friends headed out the door for an evening of much-needed fun and relaxation. Darren was sitting at his desk when his mother stepped into his room. As she stood quietly watching him work at his computer, she felt so happy and relieved with his apparent turnaround over the last couple of months. The old Darren was firmly back in control and the troll was almost non-existent, the only exception being his continual state of sadness that seemed to prevail over everything else. Although he had told her he wasn't ready to talk about Becca, she knew from his actions he was constantly thinking about her. Damn, 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 he snarled as the bottom of his fist pounded the desktop in frustration. Almost 3 months, and she hasn't responded yet. I can't have lost her, not now. Darren, baby, what's wrong? Paula asked. He jumped shouting in surprise. Oh shit. Holding one hand to his chest, he took a long, deep breath, letting it out slowly. Good God, Mom. Knock or something. Paula moved over behind her son and hugged him as he reached up, squeezing her arms in response. She grabbed a chair and sat down next to him. After draping an arm around and over his shoulder, she peered at the screen while resting her chin on the other. What's the problem, mister? Maybe your old computer-illiterate mom can help. Darren smiled to himself. His life was returning to normal except for Becca. Her absence was a big hole in his life. Too big. Nothing was going to be right until he talked to Becca. He needed to get in touch with her. Mom, I'm just upset at myself. Apparently I finally went too far and pushed Becca away. I wrote her a letter of apology over 2 months ago and have repeatedly emailed it 2 or 3 times a week, but it's a no-go. She hasn't responded. Since it appears I've struck out with her, I'm at a loss what to do. If you have any suggestions, I'm open. I can't give up. I love her too much to lose her. The frustration in his voice was obvious. Paula smiled. Well, what would you like me to do? Darren sat quietly for a moment, then opened his letter to Becca so he could let his mother read it. Placing his hands on his desk, he pushed back and stood up, steadying his balance by grabbing his cane. Pointing with the cane towards his bathroom, he said, I'm not sure, but let me take a potty break before I start seeing yellow. If you would, please read this, then let me know what you think. Paula immediately spotted the problem even before she began to read the letter. Waiting until she heard the click of the bathroom door, she quickly sent a copy of the letter to her own email account. After checking to make sure she had received it, she chuckled to herself as she closed her email. She decided not to tell him in case Becca didn't respond. No use getting his hopes up for nothing. Darren waited a bit longer than usual so his mom could read the letter. When he emerged, he noticed one of his dresser drawers was open and his mom had one of his t-shirts clutched tightly to her chest and mouth. She looked up at him as he approached. With a touch of humor to her voice, she informed, "You want me to read this letter, and you have no Kleenex." They both could see the mascara stains as she held his t-shirt in front of her. "Serves you right," she teased. Turning back, she began to read again. Darren had to get ready because Terry from physical therapy had asked him to go to martial arts class with her. Apparently, she talked to her sensei after Darren confided in her that he was a bit scared in crowds and when answering the door. "Darren can learn to walk without fear," he replied. She relayed the information to Darren, letting him think it over and weigh the possible benefits of the exercises. After considering the alternative, he figured, it couldn't hurt. Wrong. He grinned. "It will hurt, but it might just help." While he was putting on his sweats, his mom told him, "You have to find a way to make sure Becca has read this letter." Darren hugged her and with a sarcastic but loving flip, "Thanks, Mom. I'll think about how to do just that as soon as I get back tonight." While kissing him on the cheek as he headed out the door, Paula consoled, "Don't fret too much. These things have a way of working out." No sooner had the car left the driveway than Paula was on her laptop opening her email account. She giggled to herself, "Yeah, and they have a better chance of working out when moms get involved." It didn't take long to open up the email containing Darren's letter, readdress it, and send it on its way. She hoped Becca's mom still used the email account Becca had given Paula after Becca had closed hers. Neither of them had used the account for the last 2 or 3 months, but it was the only way she had to get in touch with her. Paula had somehow managed to misplace both the number to Gwen's apartment and Becca's parents' house. She shook her head. "Leave it to a pack rat like me to lose something like that at a time like this." Sitting in the restaurant sipping his coffee, Darren waited for his mom to join him for lunch. She would be dying to know how his third interview went with Gamble and Larson, an international technology wholesaler. He felt good about his chances of landing the job. The vice president of operations told Darren, if hired, the company would allow him flex time in order for him to continue his physical therapy sessions. Since Maureen's lesson in life lecture in March, Darren had become diligent about his therapy, especially since his own chicken shit attitude had kept him from progressing as he should. At the beginning of May, since he was still in heavy therapy and wasn't able to travel yet, he missed seeing Becca graduate. That had really bummed him out. He was kind of expecting her to visit after graduation, but that hadn't happened either. It appeared to be over, but his heart refused to believe that possibility. He loved her too much to accept defeat. Here it was the first week of June, almost 10 months since he last saw Becca, but he still hadn't heard anything from her since about February. That was mostly his fault too. If he could land this job, he might be able to find his lady and talk to her. At least he would have the funds to get to her. Earth to Darren, Paula said as she bent down and kissed her son's cheek before sliding into the seat across from him. "Hi, sweetie. Well, how did it go today?" He could hear the anxiousness in her voice. She was as nervous and excited about this job opportunity as he was. It hadn't been possible for her to hide her concern and anxiety since his brutal beating. No one had been able to tell her for sure what the future held for her son. Just as any caring mother, she had spent many restless nights worrying about his future. "Pretty good, I think. They keep talking about a management position at one of the local offices until I get out of therapy. I'm all for it if they actually make me an offer." He was bouncing in the seat when he added, "And Mom, thanks for being concerned and asking." Paula watched him as her own excitement built. She ordered a diet drink and a chef's salad from the waitress who appeared with a coffee refill for Darren. After ordering a Reuben sandwich for lunch, he looked at his mom. "Okay, what is it? You're way too manic for the job to be the only thing on your mind," he asked offhandedly. She shrugged her shoulders and smiled. Reaching into her purse, she withdrew a folded sheet of paper and handed it to him. Darren looked at his mom, raising an eyebrow of confusion. After taking it out of her hand and opening it, he recognized it as a print out of an email. It read, "Paula, Mom just gave me the letter you forwarded from Darren. Please give him my new email address and phone number. I can't wait to talk to him. Love you all. Becca." Darren sat as he reread the letter a dozen times before he licked his suddenly parched dry lips. "You got this today?" Paula shook her head. "Yes, but she sent it yesterday. I checked the account on a whim before I came over to meet you. Now you have a valid email address and a phone number. It's down to just the two of you now." I have done all I can. I'll be right back, I have to go to the restroom. Paula got up and Darren looked out the window, his brow wrinkled, reflecting his obvious inner turmoil. Over the last few months, he had returned to the habit of talking out loud to himself as he worked through his emotions. Good Lord, what do I say first? Well, after I'm sorry, I want to tell her how much I really love her, how much I want to be with her. But my stupidity, can she put it behind her and give us another chance? Darren said to himself as he waited for his mother to return, buried in deep thought as he continued staring out the window. He barely noticed as she slid into her seat. It slowly registered when she reached out and squeezed his hand. He was too embarrassed to look at her as he confessed, "Mom, I'm scared. I truly love her. But after all this time, how do I explain everything to her without sounding like a total idiot? I want this woman, Mom, more than anything I have ever wanted in my life. She stood by me during the hardest time of my life. Hell, she would have sacrificed everything to stay with me if I had only let her, or hadn't driven her away. How do I show her that I've changed? That I am committed to keeping my other half, that overindulged moron filled with self-pity out of my life for good?" Darren stopped for a minute, waiting for some words of wisdom or something. Anything. She put her hand on his arm, squeezing him in a reassuring gesture. As he continued, "Mom, I'm looking for help here." "Then I suggest you just turn and say it to her face and see what she has to say," came a soft reply. Darren was momentarily confused. When he turned and locked eyes with a set of ice blues, "Becca," he whispered, just before shouting, "Becca." His unexpected outburst caused the young blonde who was now sitting across from him to jump and screech in a loud voice. "Damn it, Darren. You scared me to death." When Becca yelled back, Darren jerked, smacking the knee of his good leg into the tabletop. He moaned, "Damn, that hurt." Both of them looked at each other, tears welling in their eyes. Time stood still as they watched a multitude of emotions flicker across each other's face. Slowly, they realized the whole restaurant was extremely quiet. Turning their heads to glance around, they discovered everyone was staring at them. A blushing Becca spoke out in an embarrassed but vibrant voice, "Sorry, I just surprised him. It's okay." "Really?" She squeezed his hand and arm a little tighter. She had been holding them all along and adamantly refused to let go, even as people turned back around to eat and talk. Catching his gaze, she finally spoke with a seriousness in her voice. "Darren, did you mean that?" "Yes, I really slammed my knee into the—" Becca cut him off with a giggle before he could finish. "No, Darren, I know you hurt your knee. Sorry about scaring you. I'm asking you if you meant everything you said when you were talking to yourself. I want to know if you meant everything you wrote me in the email and everything you just said." Darren didn't bat an eye but replied, "Becca, in answer to your questions, yes to both. What I said in the letter and what you just heard me say, I meant every word." She looked at Darren as if evaluating him. Long seconds passed as he began to feel very uncomfortable. "Becca," suddenly holding up her hand, Becca began speaking, "After listening to you carry on when I first sat down, then talking to you just now, I knew that my Darren is back." The first tears rolled down her pretty cheeks as she continued. "That guy at the hospital never talked out loud to himself, but my Darren did. I'm so sorry for the way I acted towards you before the attack. I've been able to see how selfish and self-centered I was when I kept pushing you to give me more time. Then by hiding from you for those 2 months prior to all of Hayden's games, I left us both open to his attacks. I never in my wildest dreams thought he was capable of those kinds of things. I wish I could fix it all, but I can't. But you need to know how sorry I am for all the things I did and didn't do." As her face streaked with tears and her emotions threatened to overflow, she almost whispered, "Can you promise me that the guy in the hospital is gone? I don't think I can take his actions or his attitude ever again. He hurt me deeply." Darren thought for a second and replied, "I want to tell you so bad that he is gone forever, but he will always be with me. I can tell you that I have daily made consistent progress in dealing with and controlling him." With a little mischief gleaming in his eyes, Darren softly said, "I do believe that 2 are stronger than 1. If I had you at my side, I bet we could keep him bottled up forever." Continuing in a more serious tone, "Besides the problems I put you through before and after my attack, I need to tell you how sorry I am for not providing the comfort and love you needed from me after I knew about the assault. I'll never forgive myself for that, Becca. I love you with all my heart and am willing to beg, crawl, or grovel to get a second chance. I believe it would be a travesty if we don't end up loving, caring, and providing for each other, sharing our lives, having our future kids, taking long walks, dining, dancing, laying in bed talking and making love all night. In other words, just living with and for each other. I want to grow as old as possible together. The biggest travesty of all would be missing out on all the happiness those things would bring if we were together. That is how I truly feel. I have no other or better way of expressing my feelings for you." Becca was crying steadily but managed to reply in a tear-choked voice. "If you can forgive me for ever asking us to be apart and all the selfish things I did while we were together, I would cherish the chance to spend the rest of my life with you." Darren's voice was thick with emotion as he croaked out, "The easiest thing in the world is to forgive you, because I love you." Becca moved out of her seat and slid in next to him. Wrapping her arms under his and around his waist, she was holding him tightly. "I forgive you, my love, for everything. I want us to be together, Darren. I've wanted it since the first day I realized I loved you. I won't let you go this time." Pulling his head down towards her, Becca kissed him with small, gentle kisses, salty from their tears. The kisses increased with fervor as they gave way to the passion that built rapidly between them. As if reading each other's minds, they seemed to realize at the same time where they were and people were still watching. Breaking from their kiss, Becca stated, "You said in your letter, in life we have to play the cards we are dealt. Well, lover, there are many different ways to play a hand of cards. We've been playing conservatively way too long. It's time we put our chips into play. We are getting married as soon as we can. Agreed?" Looking at her face all aglow, Darren knew they were finally on the same page. With an amused smile, he said, "Agreed?" His smile made her feel comfortable and secure. Darren was holding Becca tight as his mom and dad came over to the table and sat down across from them. He asked his parents in a perturbed but pleased voice, "Did you set this up?" Both of them shook their heads. Becca sat up and replied, "Nope, this was my doing. I've been at home since late May. Mom had a surgical procedure just after my graduation and needed me home to help around the house for a few weeks. While I was there, she had been trying to get me to talk about why I have been so down, just moping around. 5 days ago, I sat down and explained to her what had happened between us over the last few months. She looked me in the eyes and simply said, 'Becca Anderton, I've had enough of this. I can take care of myself well enough now that you need to get your little fanny in gear and go see him. Either bring him back or get on with your life.' I headed out 2 mornings later. The first night when I stopped to sleep, I got the email your mom sent my mom. I answered you as soon as I got online. I've read and reread your email probably 100 times since then. Checking the original email, I noticed you had sent it to my old account that I thought was closed. Was I ever surprised to discover it was still active, and all those emails you sent were just piled up there? If I'd known it was still open, I would have answered as soon as I got the first one. It took 2 more days of driving to get here. This morning when I arrived, I tried to call your mom at home but missed her. Thank goodness I have all the important numbers. I called your dad at work. Luckily he knew where the 2 of you were. We came in just as your mom was coming out of the restroom. She sent me over to the table, and the rest is history." Becca's smile was infectious as the 4 of them talked and laughed. As RJ finished, she looked over at Millie, whose eyes were wet from crying, but it was RJ who was emotionally spent. Telling their story always took a lot out of her. So you see, Millie, no one is without faults or issues to overcome. But now, almost 12 years later, we are still madly in lust and in love with each other. We have 2 very wonderful and, like everyone else's, bratty children. We're still playing the cards that life dealt us. Sometimes we win, sometimes we lose, but we are always with each other. Like the phoenix bird of lore, we have risen from the ashes of our own mistakes. Of course, RJ, the R stands for Rebecca. I should have known. Millie took a few seconds to think over the emotional roller coaster of events that had occurred since she left work the day before. "Do you think Scott and I will be okay?" RJ laughed. "Well, girl, that is up to the 2 of you. I think things will be fine, but as I found out and Darren summed up best, no more putting it off. The 2 of you need to start talking now and never stop. Long as you are talking, everything is usually okay. By the way, you are correct. RJ stands for Rebecca Jeanette." Winking at Millie, RJ sat and enjoyed the sunshine and watched the boats on the river. Sometime later, Darren held his wife as they walked to his car. Stopping to open the door for her, she couldn't help but look up at her husband. "You know," she said, "it's funny, when I was telling Millie our story, I kept thinking of Daddy. I miss him so much at times. I know, Becca, but life isn't perfect. Even though he's been gone for 3 years, I still remember his little drunken slip at the rehearsal dinner when I was telling our mothers about how Hayden was finally arrested." Becca, eyes wide with understanding, said, "Yeah, you told my mom that one of the guys, Les Rafferton, came down with a bad case of nerves, called the police, and confessed. He even told the police where the bag of clothes was buried that the 3 of them had worn that night. That was the evidence that the police really needed. Darren continued. Yep. Then later on I was telling her about Les trying to recant his confession by claiming some big dude had forced it out of him. Tried to convince the police that some guy was hiding in the back seat of his car and stuck a gun to his head after he got in. Made him call the police and confess. That's when your dad shocked us all. He had just a tad too much to drink and spontaneously interrupted me mid-sentence with that statement. There weren't even any bullets in the damn thing. Your mom almost fainted, Becca said, then continued. Your dad asked, What did you say, Phil? Daddy, as always, right to the point, just continued on. I was tired of the bullshit. It was time for justice. The a-holes, especially that Hayden creep, had got away with too much and for way too long. The son of a witch is lucky I didn't hunt him down and shoot him myself. Hurt my baby, will you? Becca said, I remember saying. But Dad, the police said Les told them the guy in the car was huge. Just before Daddy chuckled out loud. He replied, Amazing how big a man can look when viewed through the open-ended barrel of a .45, stuck between your eyes. Now we all know how the justice system works, so all of us need to keep our mouths shut. Wouldn't want to give the a-holes a reason for a mistrial or an appeal. If ever asked again, I have no idea what you're talking about, enough said. You know, Darren, I don't think I was ever prouder of him than I was at that moment. Darren replied, Me too, baby, as he hugged his wife. He let go of Becca and she nodded across the parking lot at Scott and Millie as they walked to their car. You think they will make it, lover? Before Darren could reply, Millie melted into Scott's arms as he swept her into a fiery embrace. Darren smiled. Sometimes it just takes people getting involved to help the Phoenix start the rebirth. Yeah, I have a feeling they'll be fine. Come on now, let's get home, and you can personally thank me for your tips. Her eyes narrowed as a sensuous smile crossed her face. Will you let me dress in leather and do kinky things to you? Only if I can. Ah, what the hell? I do love it when you get all kinky. Let's go home, Darren. I need some of that special love and comfort only you can provide. Surely you need some of the same from me. If not, you will before the night's over. Becca giggled as Darren snuggled her tightly against him. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.